Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners.
As part of a small line of pieces we're doing that are kind of pin-up-y type shots where they're a little bit rougher and simpler with just a portrait of a figure, no background, I want to do something to complement the piece I did earlier with Wonder Woman. And Starfire is another favorite of mine from DC, and in particular the way she was designed by George Perez, the way she appeared for, I want to say, the first 20 years of her existence before she was changed by a cartoon version that kind of took away a lot of the alluring qualities to her that were in her initial DNA. So there's a very distinctive face, hairstyle, and vibe from her when she was first created in 1980, and I wanted to connect with that.
Ed Brubaker, welcome back to Word Balloon. Ed, finally, I've seen you face to face for 15 years, but it is so lovely that you finally conceded to do a video. Good to see you, buddy.
Thanks. Yeah, I when we did our last one, I had just recently got my front tooth knocked out, and so I wasn't. Now I'm wearing like a fake retainer for the one of these teeth is not real.
Wouldn't have known.
Because I'm waiting to get the replacement. So, but yeah, I thought. No, I noticed last time some of my answers were so long, you were starting to fall asleep on your end of the video. So I was like, I'm going to get you on video this time and make sure you stay awake, motherfucker.
And now that you say it, I do remember that. And I'm so sorry because I probably was like, I don't deny it. Absolutely. This is all on the record.
It reminded me of me in high school where I'd just be like,
no, and it was Ed. I love that our conversations go in the direction.
I know.
You know that.
I figured you'd had a long day already.
But I am very alert for this conversation because Friend of the Devil. Seriously, Ed, it was outstanding. And
thanks.
Well, and
yeah, you're one of the few people who's read it so far.
Oh my God! Well,
it just came out today.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And man, I'll tell you, it was great to read. I will keep it spoiler free because it is right on the stands. But what I will say is, it is cool because just like Criminal, you guys, all three of you, you're getting better with each, next chapter. And you really pulled me in story wise, and really Sean and Jacob's art are just incredible as well. I mean, it was very immersive.
Yeah, I about like halfway through the first book. I knew I had when I first came up with the idea for Reckless, I jotted down like the first three ideas, like just like the one sentence versions of them. But it was when I was about halfway through the first book when I really started formulating what the second one was going to be. And I knew by the time I was like started it, I was like, oh, I'm actually more excited about this one than the first one, even because the first one, like I love the first one, but it's like partly an origin story. So it's like you want to see what happens next and like why does this case matter? Plus, I always loved the idea of you meet a character in 1981. The next book takes place in 1984. You're like, what happened in those? Because it's like I think I told you before, it's like, if you talk to real private eyes, it's like every case is not worth writing a book about. Most cases are really boring, and a guy like Ethan doesn't take that many cases even. So, but I loved the time jump of it all, and like that it hits him as like an old man kind of looking back and writing about his youth as like a troublemaker for hire. But yeah, I did a lot of research for this new one too, just because as much as I was writing about like times that I lived through in like the 70s and 80s, I was drawing on a lot of those memories and stuff, but I knew that at least one of the major threads of the story was going to be about like Vietnamese immigrants after the Vietnamese refugees after the war. Because when I moved to San Diego, it was like right around right before all the the war was over, and a lot of Vietnamese were moving to America, and I wanted to have that be part of the story, because I feel like every one of those books I feel like has to touch a little bit on something that was really going on in society at that point, some kind of societal rot, you know, as Patton called it in his blurb. Because I thought about that a lot. So like I'm working on the third one now. We're like probably about a little less than halfway done with that one. And that one, you know, I just ended up like falling into a huge research hole. Even though I knew what it was going to be, I just like ended up like looking at some maps and looking at like neighborhoods and how they'd changed over the years in LA, because I wanted to make sure I got all this stuff right. And I just ended up falling down this huge research hole of, you know, like changing demographics in Los Angeles from like World War II up until like modern times. And I was like, holy shit, you could spend days like, and like, so something that was just going to be a background element has ended up growing into something that's like a big kind of Chinatown-y or Roger Rabbit-y kind of like LA story that I was like, oh, no one really talks about this part of LA history. So I was like, they talk about the different areas of LA, but people don't connect these different things together, like the cause and effect of, you know, how some of these neighborhoods changed, how like Compton went from being like a mostly Japanese neighborhood to being like a very white, like, you know, neighborhood by the end of the war, because all the Japanese had been put in an internment camp.
Right.
And
Wow.
you know, like and then vets returning from war basically bought those houses. And so suddenly I was like, oh wow, I had no idea about this. And you know, and then there's a lot of stuff that, you know, you can just kind of stumble into. That's why I love doing the period piece stuff, because, you know, even when you look back at the past, so much of it is still so relevant to what we're doing today. But I love falling on those research holes where you find like some bit of research that ties into what you were already writing anyway, and just makes it feel like almost inevitable or something, you know?
You know, I was watching your Forbidden Planet interview, or
Oh
maybe,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And you had mentioned that, you know, the LA that you're depicting and stuff wasn't LA that you would visit when you were living in San Diego. And knowing that you're the big punk guy and stuff, I was also wondering if, and maybe in the subsequent Destroy All Monsters, the next chapter, did you ever go to the Olympic and see any LA punk shows and stuff?
No, I was so young when I graduated high school at 17, because I started school in Gitmo. So I started like a year before, because we had different rules on the military base for how old you had to be to start like first grade or kindergarten or whatever. So I was like the youngest kid in my class.
Great.
But when we would drive up to LA, I was like 15, 16 years old then. So we couldn't get into a lot of clubs. We'd go up and we'd go see like the decline of Western civilization. Or we'd drive up to Orange County and go to like an all ages club where there'd be like punk bands playing that had come down from LA. And that's where you'd see like the skinheads beating the shit out of people. It was terrifying.
Yeah.
But a lot of times we would drive up for like a day trip, like me and a couple friends would drive up and just go shopping at like, there was this place called The Poser in like Santa Monica, which strangely like it was like the punkest place to buy. Like that was, for a while, it was the only place you could get creepers in Southern California, those ska shoes. But you could get your Doc Martens and your creepers, and you know, and next door they had like a barbershop where you could get cool haircuts, and you know. So we'd come up and we'd sort of be like, we were definitely like not as cool as LA punk rock people. Like LA punk rock people were fucking hardcore. Like, I mean, you watch The Decline of Western Civilization, the first one, and you're like, oh, these people, like I would not. Like I'd go to one of those shows and just end up being beaten up probably if I tried to go in the pit. But punk rock was like scary back then when you were like 15 years old. Like when the first time I went to like a punk show in San Diego, like there was like all these all ages places, and like that's why like, you know, mostly it would be like three local bands and then like one band from LA, like the Angry Samoans or someone would be there. But there was a place on San Diego State called the Back Door. There were two clubs there. I can't remember what the top one. It was like, I remember what the top one was called, but the downstairs one was called the Back Door. And that was just like a tiny little club. And I saw X play there like 10 times probably. And there was a bowling alley on the other side of the complex.
That's kind of perfect.
If you went into the bowling alley, yeah, one time Jim Carroll was doing a reading at the Back Door. And the bowling alley had one of those little like play basketball like video game things where you just shoot like a certain number of balls. And I walked into the bowling alley because there was a way to sneak in from the bowling alley. I'm probably blowing this for the people at SDSU right now because it's probably still low. But if you go through the bowling alley, there's like an exit door at the back, and you can walk around inside and get into the inside of the club. And then we would go in early and hide in the bathroom and wait for the show to start and then come out. Because a lot of times it was like 18 and over, and we were like 15, 16. But I met Jim Carroll there. He was like standing there, like shooting hoops, and there was a bunch of people standing around. And he just looked back and he's like, "Anyone want to play?" And I was like, "Well, of course I'm gonna play basketball with Jim Carroll." And I went and I missed every single shot. It was the worst basketball diaries of my life. But you know, I got to shoot hoops with Jim Carroll in a bowling alley in San Diego. So. But yeah, that was more my like punk rock experience, was like those kind of clubs at you know, around the colleges and stuff, where a lot of the punk bands would come down. Like I saw the Ramones play there.
Oh, that's great.
A lot of British bands, like REM played like when no one knew who they were, and Michael Stipe stood with his back to the audience the entire time because he was shy, I guess, or it was an act. I don't know.
I saw U2 when they were still.
Oh yeah,
relatively unknown, you know, just starting off with Boy.
Yeah, I remember them touring and coming through San Diego. I missed all that stuff. I saw a lot of ska bands come through. Like I saw like
yes,
yeah, saw Madness once. Like
that's great.
Yeah, like I don't think I ever saw the Specials. We saw the English Beat open for the Clash once, and that was at the same place that the Comic-Con used to be held at Montezuma Hall. Back in the same day. I remember this girl from my school like jumping down off the balcony to land on a table, and some punk rock guy moved the table at the same time, and she broke both her legs. And her sister was there too, and she's like, "I'll meet you at the hospital after the show," because she didn't want to miss the Clash. But that was the Combat Rock tour. I remember that. But that was like a huge show. That wasn't like little club. Like,
oh yeah, that was.
We got to see the Clash the way, like, you know. But yeah, I don't know. I was always more of like I was never part of any scene really. I think just because growing up on military bases, I never have been a joiner of anything or anyone who really felt comfortable in a crowd of people. I remember once being at like a movie theater when they were playing like one of those like the Decline or Dance Craze or whatever, and a bunch of people started kind of rioting and tearing out seats and stuff. And I just remember just leaving and just thinking, what a bunch of fucking idiots. Like why would anyone want to be part of a mob, you know? And it just, my whole life I've just been like, I don't want to be part of any group, you know. Not also I wouldn't want to be part of anyone that would have me as a member, as Groucho used to say.
Well, Ethan Reckless reflects a lot of those points of view, and in fact you might not know it if you haven't already read Friend of the Devil, but we've actually discussed a little portion of that in that little talk about punk rock and everything. And I love the way that all fit into the book and the narrative. And I love the theater, and I love how Ethan, that's his like kind of fortress of solitude.
Yeah.
He wants to like stay away from the rest of the real world, which I think is a great device.
Yeah, it's a big plot point in the third book too, is the movie theater. But yeah, that was like when I was sitting down with my notebook the day that I decided we weren't going to do this one project and we were going to do this series of graphic novels instead. And I just bounced the basic idea off Sean, and then I sat down and I just started jotting down like, what would I want if I were like one of these like paperback pulp heroes from the 70s? Like where would my hangout be? What would my vehicle be? Like who's my sidekick? Like, you know, because they all of those characters all have these kind of things, you know. It's like, or like Bond with his gadget guy Q, you know. It's like
Travis McGee with his boat, as we've discussed before.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's certain things that come with those tropes, and I think like having a cool hangout or a headquarters is like one of those things where it was like, it's funny. I think I came up with the idea for the abandoned movie theater being a headquarters for something like 15 years ago for another project that never ended up getting off the ground, and it always just stuck in the back of my head as like, oh, I got to do that someday, because it was going to be like a cool place to get like a briefing because you could have it on the screen.
Sure.
You know?
Oh, those great movies, spy movies and the like. I remember Richard, I want to say, oh God, I can't think of his name now, but he played Bulldog Drummond in the British movies. And there's that movie Danger Route, which is a
Oh yeah,
level spy movie. And literally, you know, that moment where the spy master and the agent are getting their information and stuff, they're like watching a movie. And I think
oh
that's,
wow, oh
yeah,
wow, I gotta check that out. I've never seen that.
it's,
Um,
you know, for what it is, I mean, it moves slow, but I can appreciate why Tarantino was such a fan of those movies. That and Deadlier Than the Male. It's that
yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I love that movie, of
Oh my
course.
God, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, about how like Tarantino got famous and rich and bought, the Beverly Cinema, and it was I was like there's some part of me that really wants there to be a display of the Reckless books like on the counter at the Beverly Cinema. I'll have to reach out to them about that. Just give them some free books to sell because I'm just like it's such a cool idea. He's like like a private eye off the books who works out of a movie theater and he spends his day just like by himself or with his sidekick, like watching cool old movies. And I mean, we can talk about. We should talk about the book a little bit. We could try to avoid spoilers, as much as possible for any big twists and stuff. But I feel weird. We're going to be airing this, and the book has just come out. We should definitely talk about it.
No, and I really do think we are in terms of, really, and also, so if you want, yeah, go ahead, and I'll come back because honestly, it was interesting hearing what seems to be a checklist for you to create this kind of character, and that you need to have these certain elements and stuff, and I think that's really
Well, yeah, because I mean, the big part of it, though, I agonize over everything and I make it harder than it needs to be. Not to like a Matt Fraction level where I'm just like, I was talking to Elsa yesterday, and I was describing the two different types of writers. One's the architect and one's the gardener. And I was like, Matt is definitely an architect. And like Jonathan Hickman is an architect. Like if you ever see his notebook, you're like, oh yeah, okay. He knows every single step along the way. And I'm like, I know like 5 steps along the way and where it ends, but I let it grow as I'm writing it to some degree. But like one of the things that I thought would be really fun about doing a thing like this was like I've been reading so many like pulp novels and mystery novels and stuff since the pandemic started. Like I just went back to like I didn't want to read anything too serious or depressing, or like I was talking to someone about this just yesterday or the other day. I was like, have you read the new Ishiguro? Like it's getting great reviews. And they were like, yeah, but it looks like another really depressing, like Never Let Me Go kind of. I'm like, yeah, but that's one of my favorite books. It's like, yeah, but we're in a pandemic. I was like, yeah, that's true. I've been reading like the last month. I've read nothing but like every Michael Connelly book that I've missed in the last 10 years. I'm like totally caught up on all Michael Connelly because I've just like they're just addictive. You read them in 2 or 3 days, and like I just had been doing like that kind of stuff, like or going back and reading like old Richard Stark books and like Ross McDonald, and that was where that and looking at like all those cool old pulp covers. Like there's an edition of the Lou Archer books that came out in the 70s that all have these great Mitchell Hooks like montage covers. And I just loved the looks of those. And I just thought if we could do something that had this kind of feel, like we could really do something fun. And I was having so much fun on Friday that I felt like the thing I was about to start working on for Sean would have ended up just being too dark and too kind of like it wouldn't have been fun to write when you're like stuck in a pandemic and the world feels like it's ending every day. And I wanted to do something that was bringing that kind of joy that I was getting out of all these like pulp books I was reading. And I've always aspired to that too. Like I've always, in the back of my mind, I've always thought I would love to be able to get away with just doing a series of graphic novels with the same character, like a Jack Reacher in comics or something. And I just thought, well, why not? Like we're never going to be bigger than we are right now as far as the ability to launch a project. Our audience clearly loves hardback books because we just had 2 original ones that sold out like almost instantly. But really a lot of it was just like I thought it would be fun, and I thought like it would be easier than it's been. Of course, each one gets a little bit harder than the one before because like the first one was mostly fun for the first half of it, and then I was just agonizing to make sure I fit everything in before I ran out of, because I knew we had a deadline and Sean would only be able to draw X amount of pages, you know, we had a page count set. So even doing a graphic novel, I still have to stick under a certain amount of pages for these at least, because we're doing 144 page books. You know, so it's just like the end of it, the second half of every comic, but now it's like I have like 2 months of just like really free fun, and then 2 months of like, oh my god, did I waste these pages, or you know, and going back and cutting things and moving things around. But yeah, I love the different aspects of the genre, like the tropes of the genre, how there is like a gadget guy or like a sidekick, or you know, like just that whole thing, like the Thin Man books with, you know, Nick and Nora Charles, like that kind of, you know, those characters you want to just keep returning to and see what happens with them next and what mystery they get into. Like it just felt like something that would be a lot of fun and that would appeal both to non-comic book people and to the people who've been reading our stuff all these years, you know, because, you know, if anybody understands like following a character from one adventure to the next, it's people who've been going to comic stores their whole life.
Of course.
You know? Which is strange because I do keep having to explain to people that the books are self-contained. Like you get a whole mystery in each book. It doesn't end with a cliffhanger. This isn't volume 1 of X. It's like, we'll do as many of these books as we have ideas for, or as I, you know, until Sean gets sick of drawing them. You know,
Sure.
Like we were gonna do 3 and take a break and do like something a little bit longer. And then the first book was such a hit, and Kirkman was like, how many of these are you doing? And I was like, well, we're gonna do 3 and then we'll take a break and we'll probably come back and do a couple more. And then he's like, you're gonna take a break after the 3rd one? Why do you always stop doing things when people like it? And so I thought about it for a minute and I was like, well, he has a point. And then suddenly I instantly had a way, because I figured by the end of the 3rd book, Sean would just be sick of drawing these characters and I'd be like needing to take a breather. And then almost instantly I had an idea for books 4 and 5 and a way to make it feel different enough that it would be like, you know, a breath of fresh air coming off of the 3rd book. So so then I just told Sean, I'm like, all right, well, we're gonna go through and just do 5 in a row and then we'll take a break and do the other book, probably.
Interesting.
So, unless they're selling like 50,000 units every time, and we'll probably just do these forever.
I only wish you know, success in either way as far as that goes. But so, do you think you'll be releasing 2 a year? Do you think that's the rhythm?
I mean, I think we can pull that off. Yeah, because we've been basically doing 2 graphic novels a year. You know, depending on like Cruel Summer was, you know, 10 issues of a comic or 9 issues of a comic, and one of them's like double size. But you know, we've been averaging about 2, you know, collections of our stuff every year. So yeah. I think, you know, doing these, like the 3rd one comes out in the middle of October. So the 4th one will probably be, you know, March of the next year. Or, you know, yeah, probably March because February is a short month.
Okay.
But yeah, and then we'll go right from that into the 5th one in the fall. So yeah, we'll get like 5 of them out pretty quick, about as fast as we would have put out collections, maybe a little bit faster. And as far as efficiency goes, like all 3 of us, like me and Sean and Jake, all prefer just doing the graphic novel straight through. Like Sean doesn't have to stop once a month and do covers. For Jake, he doesn't have to give a week of every month to our book while he's trying to do all his own stuff too. Which is like, I definitely don't want to lose Jake. Jake is, you know, my favorite colorist.
He's doing great.
You know, like I love that he's Sean's son. And I saw Jake post a picture of himself like holding Friend of the Devil on his Twitter today. And I was like, God, Jake almost looks like Sean when we started working together.
Right. That's
like, it's been that long. But yeah, I was like, now Jake, you know, colors our book, you know, a month and a half or something of his life, like every 6 months. And so he's got all this other time to just concentrate on his own stuff. And then you know, he just has to color the first chapter for the, you know, like when we solicit the book. So it's like efficiency wise, I can't believe how much faster we're all working. And, you know, Sean's like, if anything, has gotten faster doing these. It's like that's my goal every week, is just to make sure, you know, like I said, I'm getting my second vaccine shot tomorrow. So I'm like trying to make sure I have all of Sean's pages done before whatever the second shot fatigue hits me. But like every week I have to make sure, you know, that Sean has X amount of pages to keep moving forward. And that's a big part of why we're so productive, of course, is because Sean is a machine. But you know, also amazing.
Well, but you guys have really, and now that Jacob's really, you can tell he's more comfortable. And I was watching that Another Planet interview you guys did, and it was great to hear that Jacob is, you know, really taking control of the coloring. And again, I think Friend of the Devil, it's just another step forward.
Yeah, I really love what he does. We barely give him any notes almost ever. I just always tell him not to use brown because I hate brown. Like as a default background color, I'm always like, use purple instead. But also because they came to California when it was brown, and I was like, it used to be green. Like in the 80s, it was not this brown, it was like yellow and green. But yeah, no, Jake is really, you know, is really coming to his own here, and he colors Sean differently than he colors himself too, which I think is really a fun thing. But yeah, I really love how he colors outside the lines. It feels more like, you know, like just the kind of thing I've always kind of wished more people would do in comics, to the point now where like I show his stuff to other people and I'm like, you guys should consider using some of these effects. Like, I guess I don't want everyone to do it because then everyone's comics would look like ours. But I do feel like that freedom of coloring outside the lines, which, you know, so few colorists actually try, has really made it kind of impressionistic in a way.
I agree. And I also think that the level of technology that colorists are able to use now has made a big difference. I remember seeing and talking to Gene Colan about stuff that was printed in the 80s. And it's such a shame because, again, they didn't have the control that they do now.
Oh yeah. Every now and then when I was growing up, I worked at comic stores for like, you know, either very little under the table money or like you just do trade for back issues.
Oh my God.
But every now and then someone would come in trying to sell like art or something. And I remember one time someone came in and they had a bunch of color guides for like Marvel Comics from the mid 70s, which were just like Xeroxes that were like watercolored, and then they had all the lines which had the different color. And I was just like, man, they looked so cool and like so much more fleshed out than what got printed. And it's like, if you look at, like, I think Batman Year One was the first time that the color guide got printed in the trade paperback. In the comic books, when they came out, the color guide was used and it was like hand separated colors, just like the old school days, because it's the mid 80s. But when they collected it a couple years later, I think they used Richmond Lewis's painted colors on the collection actually. And now that's, I think, the colors we all see on those books. But if you go back and you look at the actual comics that came out, they were all flat colors.
Right.
You know, and at that point, and that was, you know, that book, because it was a newsprint book, was not using blue line painted colors, which had started to be a thing. But because they had that technology, they were able to like do that post with her like color guides, because they were just so beautiful, and everybody who'd seen them were just like, oh, these look so much better than the printed book. And so that's how that ended up happening.
You know, reaching back, I used to love, I really loved the way and texture that things looked in Gotham Central. And I really felt that Michael's art, and I don't remember who the colorist was, but
it was Matt Hollingsworth usually.
Oh, it was Matt Hollingsworth. Yeah. Great. Because I really felt the news rag was work, you know, for being and I don't even know if you and Greg and Mike had that kind of control of, do you want it to be a slick or do you want it to be news rag?
No, we definitely had no control over anything at DC. I mean, there's still an issue at Gotham Central that's never been reprinted properly. Like the issue 12, the first of the Joker storyline.
Dead Robin?
The sniper one where the Joker's the sniper.
Okay. Yep.
Dead Robin was like in the 20s or 30s.
Okay.
This is the one where the Joker like kills the mayor and kills the chief of police. And what was that one called? Soft Targets.
What was Hard Targets?
Soft Targets.
Soft Targets, excuse me.
Yeah. And that one, the first the first issue, there's even a scene where Driver like sticks out his hand. He's like, oh, the snow's really coming down. But someone in production forgot to scan all of Michael Lark's overlays that had the snow layer. So there was no, because it was the old days when they were still scanning stuff by hand. Hold on 1 second.
No problem.
Hey. Oh yeah, sorry. That's
No problem, man.
Got a delivery.
Hey man, that's life right now.
The watchdog. I know everything is delivered. But yeah, so like, and strangely, I think there's one trade paperback where they corrected that error. But I remember when every time they reprinted, I try to remind them, like, can we find that snow layer somewhere? Like somewhere there's a scan of 24 pages of snow. But now technology is so good they could just get Michael to just redo it probably. But yeah, it drives me crazy. And there was like one of the Gotham Central trade paperbacks collected the Harvey Bullock story that Michael and I did, which I thought was like my best thing that I did with Gotham Central probably on my own. They left out an entire page of dialogue. There's like a scene where like the police chief is talking to Driver, and there is literally no dialogue on those 2 pages. And but it was in the comic books when they got printed. So it's just like, because it was old and they used to just, that they have, you know, that was only one time when they did that wrong. But yeah, no, unfortunately, like we, you know, the creators have no input for, you know, what the quality of your paper is going to be when you're at the big 2 or almost any publisher. I think Image is really the only publisher where you get a say in your paper stock. And I actually did look into doing newsprint a few years back, because when we were doing Junkies, that was one of the things we looked at, was like, maybe we do like a heavy newsprint.
Wow.
And it turns out newsprint is not any cheaper to print on nowadays, because
Wow.
well, paper prices in general are like, if you look at printing costs over the last 10 years, like it costs probably 40 or 50% more to print the books, maybe even more, and it's all paper. Like the printing fees have gone up a tiny amount, like, you know, like, but nothing compared to what paper prices have gone up. And that's like the crazy thing about, you know, like when you start putting these books out. I remember when I first came to Image, everybody was using slick paper like Saga, and I wanted to use like a matte paper. And I think we put out Fatale, and like Kirkman and Hickman both liked the paper that Fatale was on, and so they both put all their books on that. And 2 months later, we had to try to find new paper because like Robert reprinted all the Walking Dead books with it. I was like, hey, how's my paper? So it's kind of funny. Those are like the little things that go on in printing that, like, I love that. Like the, you know, the woman at Image who oversees all the printing and stuff is like one of the people I talk to the most, because like she's like as much of a print nerd as me. Like we talk about what the paper smells like.
No, you're right, Matt. Well, you know, and forgive me, Ed, but this inspires another question. When you did that Criminal magazine, and again, you really tried to echo that feeling of those old Marvel black and whites when you did it.
Yeah.
So digitally, how do you, like, was it available as a digital product and everything?
Yeah. You could get that digitally.
I mean, was it a reprint?
We did fake yellowed paper on that. Like Sean just colored that, like, so it looked like faded newsprint. You can make stuff that looks like it, but it still won't have that same raw paper feel.
Of course.
And we did do, you know, we did a couple of graphic novels on that raw paper stock too. And I just, like, I was happy with them, but like when I got my comps, it's like if you would look at one and then you would look at the other, like certain sequences would be completely different depending on where they were in the print run, because raw paper soaks up the ink a little bit more. So some of the stuff, you know, depending on what copy I was looking at, would look darker than another. And it just, as a control freak, you know, like my level of anxiety about what the final product is gonna be is like too high, and I'm like, yeah, I can't trust it. So we're like, that's why we use the matte finish paper, because I'm like, there, the colors look basically like what I saw on my screen. You know, a little bit duller because they're printed, which is fine.
Yeah, no. All right, back to the contents of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a
I'm
great,
sure all your viewers are super obsessed about the print quality.
and you'd be surprised. Honestly,
Yeah, no, I mean it. Like, I think comic nerds, like, one of the reasons I think that these books are doing so well for us is because they're really cool objects too. Like, well, I'm all about creating objects. I mean, you can see I have like a, you know, well, those are mostly my own criminal books back there. Yeah, I love the object nature of it. Like, I'm too old to ever, like, digital comics will never replace printed comics to me, because it's just not the same experience reading something digitally. I never, even like when I used an iPad regularly, I never really relaxed when I was using it. I always ended up looking at like the internet or checking my email, and I'd be trying to read a comic or something and I'd get 5 pages through. I just, like, I could never lose myself in the experience the way I'd grown up reading comics and books and stuff. Like, it's just different experience. And now I read every day. Like, I'm back to, like, now that I've been a couple years off of social media, like, my reading habits and the pandemic, I think, really kicked into gear. Like, once I streamed every possible TV show in my, like, off hours, like, now I'm like, all right, well, I guess I have 400 books I haven't read that I want to get through. But yeah, now I'm like reading a ton, and I love single tasking it, you know?
of course, no, absolutely. Well, and that's why I don't know how much you want to get being off the grid, and NFTs I think are this
Oh
great.
God. Yeah. I have no interest in that at all. It's a weird thing to me. Anytime when something like that, or Bitcoins or whatever, like, it's like, whatever, like, sure. I mean,
Yeah,
I guess Bitcoin makes as much sense as money does, because it's all just an idea at this point.
great, good Lord, especially
You know,
given the last 2 years.
I mean, it's always been an idea. Like, what the hell is gold worth? What does anybody make with gold that they need gold for? You know, like, it's not the Industrial Revolution or whatever. Like, I don't know. It's just like people just decide, like, tulips used to be worth money. Like, come on. So the idea of like digital blockchains being a thing, and I'm just like, I don't know. I guess if it's a way for artists to sell their original art, because that was the big thing. A lot of artists, comic artists, switched over to being digital, and then suddenly like, they lost a third of their income from, like,
Sure.
not selling artwork. And you know, I know Sean, when he was drawing digital, you know, as opposed to now, he pencils digital and prints out the blue lines and then inks on paper, so he has original art. But I think also that's because he missed actually using a real brush and using paper, you know.
Yeah.
So, but it's interesting to see, like, I feel like that those years that he drew digitally kind of affected how he drew in general. Like, his stuff is a little bit different looking than it was before he had those digital years. It's a little bit tighter, but now that he's back to inking freehand, like, there's some real raw roughness in there, which I love.
Agreed. No, and again, it's the physical item that I think really does champion the digital version of anything. So back to the story, though, it's great to see, like, Ethan can't get away from his past, and in the second chapter, there's a lot of echoes, obviously, of what you put in the first Reckless story, and we're going to see characters that we've seen in the past and stuff, and there's some really cool twists and turns with them. But yeah, it's like, again, you've built this world that I mean, maybe that's just a recurring thing, that the sins of the past are always going to kind of fuck Ethan up.
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought of this one more as like, the first one was so much about him and his history, and I thought this one was really the first one where we see him really taking a case that is like the kind of case he would take, but he takes it for someone who he cares about. So, which is always like, it's a terrible idea to do business with people that you love. But I also think, like, I wanted that to be like when you're on a missing persons case and you get to a point in it where you're like, no matter what the end result of this quest is, it's going to partly ruin my life. You know, it's like, but I can't stop this quest now. And I really wanted this book to sort of show you more of, you know, him as an investigator and him as sort of a guy who seeks justice. like that streak of justice. Like there's that scene at the end, that's that splash page, you know, which shows him like after the story ends, like what he gets up to. I don't want to spoil that for people, but that was like one of my favorite things. I remember writing that page down in my notebook early on because I had that whole monologue that he does there, like figured out. And I remember thinking, this is where you really sort of get to see who he is and like what he's about in a lot of ways in this second book. Like the first book, you met him and you kind of learned about all his problems and his history, and you know, and then the case was such a twisty turning affair where by the time you get to the end of it, you kind of realize that a lot of the things that you thought it was about, it isn't really about, and it was really much more back on him. And this one, you know, I just wanted to show like sort of the larger life around him too. Like I loved the idea of, you know, like a guy who basically has no emotions and then his dad dies. And it's like, well, what does he do in that case? Like what do you fall back on in those moments of how do you grieve when you are sort of removed from your emotions, and what does that do to you as a person? And so his way of grieving was similar to mine, which was to, you know, just kind of surround yourself in the nostalgia of your past from the days before things went wrong, you know. And that's one of the things I love the most about this character is I think as much as he's definitely not me, like I'm able to put so much of my own history into him because, you know, I've never seen, you know, another PI character that was like a Navy brat, you know, like me. Like, because almost every like PI character or adventurer character or whatever, they're always about whatever city they're from.
Right.
And it's like, I remember that's one of the things I loved as a kid about reading these books is that it was always about like what city they were from, because I didn't have that experience. You know, I remember when I watched the movie Diner, like, which is such a Baltimore movie.
Yes.
And I had lived in Maryland. I was born in Maryland and lived in Sterling Park, Maryland when my dad was in Vietnam. But like, I didn't have like 5 friends that I grew up with that I'd known since I was a little kid. This is a thing that 80%, 90% of America that's their normal world, is like you're born somewhere, you spend most of your life there, you go to high school with people you went to elementary school with. You know, it may suck, just like high school sucked for me, but there were people that you knew your whole life. Whereas for me, it was much more normal to know people for a year or two and then never see them again for the rest of my life.
Wow. Really
So I remember being really jealous watching Diner, like of these guys that had this friendship that lasted their whole life, even into adulthood. They could still get back together, and it was like they were the same where they were kids. Whereas I was always like the outsider who was meeting everybody new for the first time and waiting for them all to find out I was the nerd who was into comics, and they would start making fun of me.
Did they really? Did you didn't like get any other nerds that you were friends with over the years?
When I was young, like elementary school, other kids were into comics. Sure. But once junior high started and people started getting into sports and cars and you know, I mean, I guess not cars, but like surfing or whatever, like it was, you know, the 70s and 80s, like comics were not an accepted thing. It was, you can forget, right. Like it was that year when like Dark Knight and Watchmen and Mouse came out that people started taking comics seriously in pop culture at all. It was like Frank Miller getting a feature thing in Rolling Stone.
I remember.
Up until that, like, you know, you didn't tell people if you were into comics really, or if you were working in comics and you'd have to explain to your relatives why they weren't pornography or something. Like it was a weird time really. I remember vividly when I was in 12th grade, I would have been like 16 at this point, and I used to not have a last period because I had gotten kicked out of computer classes for showing up stoned too many times. And so I had no sixth period. So on New Comic Book Day, I would leave after 5th period and take the bus up to the comic store and get all the new comics. But back then, New Comics was Friday. And I remember being on the bus home, and I had my bag from the comic store on my lap. And this girl from my school got on the bus, and like at one of the stops, like the second stop, like right after I'd gone on. And this was like a girl from like the cool crowd who normally at school would walk right by me and not even acknowledge my presence most of the time. And I remember she saw me on the bus, and you know, you're getting on the bus, it's like public transportation, you're like a 16 or 17-year-old kid. You're so happy if you see a face of anybody that you know there. And I remember she did one of these like, hey, and came over and sat with me. And I was just like, oh my God, don't ask me about the bag on my lap. And of course, that was all she wanted to talk about. I was like, what's in this bag? And the more that I didn't want to talk about what was in the bag, the more she wanted to see what was in the bag, because I'm sure she thought it was pornography. And so eventually I remember, and I was like, you know, I had an undiagnosed anxiety disorder, I think, as a kid. So I was like, fine, here. And I handed them to her, and she starts looking at it. And it was like a bunch of superhero comics, and probably like issues of like Reed Fleming, World's Toughest Milkman, or stuff that I was into at that point too. Or Love and Rockets might have been like the coolest thing in the bag that day. But it was really funny because she was like, I like comics.
Oh, that's great.
You do not. Like, I had never met a girl that would have said that straight up. From the time I was like a little kid, you know, when you'd go to like some, like your mom's friend's house, and they'd have like a kid who also had a collection of comics, and every now and then there'd be like a girl who had some, you know, Little Lulus or Little Dot or something. But it was, you know, like when I grew up, like I can't believe people are not overjoyed at the fact that it's no longer like a stigma, than that girls are super into comics now, because it's like, thank God, like, because that was hard to deal with as a kid. Like, I remember my older brother being like, you got to stop being into comics, man. Like, you know, you're in high school now, you got to like get into cars and sports and stuff. And like, it was just known like as a thing. That's how I got my first comics as a kid, was my dad went to his office when we were living in Gitmo and asked all of his friends at the office if their kids had any comics they had grown out of. Like, that was just a thing that was assumed that we would all just grow out of this art form, you know. And that was like the comics era that I grew up in. So I'm so glad now when I go to like comic conventions, when they come back eventually, that like there's, you know, like half the people there are like girls or women. And it's
absolutely,
like
100%. Yes.
You know? But I will never forget that day on the bus of being like so terrified that, oh my God, everyone's gonna find out I'm into comics. Like my secret shame of like the thing I spent my entire life doing now. Like, what an idiot. Like, if I'd have only known not to be like, you know, ashamed of this thing that I love, that I've loved my whole life, like I would have been such a happier and probably cooler person. Because whatever you're into, if you're not like, the whole idea of a guilty pleasure is so stupid. Like, why would you be guilty about anything that you actually get joy out of? Like, you know, I watch a lot of dumb sitcoms. Every now and then my wife is like, you're watching this? And I'm like, don't shame me. I don't care. I know it's live 3 camera.
You turn your writer hat off watching sitcoms and stuff? Because, you know, go ahead.
It depends on the sitcom. You know, I'm still picky. I won't just watch anything. But yeah, I love watching, you know, I'm like a guy who likes to watch a good romantic comedy, actually, which is really funny. Like, I still have a secret goal of trying to do like a crime story version of a romantic comedy.
Oh, that'd be great.
Like a crime story with the structure of a romantic comedy that begins with like the meet cute or whatever.
Sure.
Which is, I hate the phrase meet cute. It's like, why is it meet cute? Why isn't it cute meat? I guess cute meat sounds kind of disgusting. Sounds like a Chip Zdarsky book. But yeah, I take in so much pop culture, but most of what I take in stuff, you know, that's just like enjoyable for me. Like, I don't, you know, I told a friend of mine one of my favorite shows was Upstart Crow, and they were like, oh yeah, my dad likes that. I was like, well, I'm probably only like 10 years younger than your dad. I was like, well, I'll watch anything David Mitchell's in. Plus, it's the guy from The Young Ones and Blackadder who writes it. So,
oh wow,
it's like it's like I'm growing older with him, and now he's doing stuff aimed at people's grandparents, and I'm like, yeah, I guess I'm their age.
What is that on Upstart Crow?
You can watch it on Amazon if you have like one of the BritBox or
I
one
do.
of those Acorn. I can't remember
Okay,
which one it's
I have
on.
them both.
But
I
yeah,
have.
there's like 3 or 4 seasons of it, and they did a pandemic special, which was because Shakespeare actually lived through a couple pandemics himself and wrote plays during them. So it was really funny.
Oh, that's cool.
A little too referencing our modern years.
Yeah, definitely. It's so funny. I literally watching again that Another Planet video, and you were talking about Ken Russell and Lair the White Worm,
Oh
and
yeah.
discovering Hugh Grant in there and Andrew, who was interviewing you guys. The way you guys were talking, I had that same experience. I just got Acorn and BritBox and went back and watched Rumpole of the Bailey with Leo McKern, which is one of my absolute
Oh
favorites.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
I saw Elizabeth Hurley in one, and
Oh yeah.
she's a baby in that. It was like 1982 or whatever.
Yeah, she's been around forever. She's in like a couple episodes of Morse too, like
Oh
Inspector
wow,
Morse.
cool.
She's in
Sure.
like I think she's in like a two-parter from like the late like mid 90s or something,
Okay.
or maybe like, but yeah, I remember she's like a student somewhere, so she's like supposed to be like high school age, or she's probably like 5 years older than she's playing. But yeah, I love a lot of British TV. I actually think one of the best shows on right now, which Amazon has on one of those channels, BritBox or Acorn, is that Line of Duty show.
Oh, I'm gonna have
Um,
to watch. Yeah, I've seen it.
yeah, it's this guy Jed Mercurio writes them all, and he's written for a bunch of different British TV shows. I think he might be a playwright too, but he's like the best thriller writer in TV right now, for my money. Like he did a thing on Netflix a couple years ago or last year, probably like 2 years ago, called The Bodyguard.
Yeah,
That
I love
starred,
that. That was
yeah, the
amazing.
guy who played Rob Stark. Yeah, yeah, he has a show. I think it's the biggest show in on BBC for like the
Wow.
last like 20 years now. They have the first 5 seasons of it, which they're only like 6 episodes each
Sure.
usually, on Amazon, and I watched all of them because the 6th season is going to drop over here pretty soon. But yeah, every season they have like a big guest star who's like a crooked cop that the lead people are all like trying to hunt crooked cops, which is like so far ahead of the curve because he launched the show like 10 or 12 years ago. But they did a really interesting thing. They have a guy who was like a minor character in the first season as like a 12-year-old kid who continued to be on the show with the same actor as he grew up,
Wow.
and like ended up, yeah, he has like a whole character arc through the seasons to the point where he's in his like mid-20s, and you're like, wow, I've never seen that on a show before.
No, that's amazing. God, that's like Coronation Street.
Yeah, but they're just, they're really fun. It's like fun, like thriller kind of TV, like that Bodyguard thing. It was just a total thriller. Like it had topical stuff that it touched on that was like a little bit like, oh yeah, this is like our world now. But it mostly was about the characters and like these kind of twists and turns that they get into, and it's just a lot of fun. Like I love that kind of popcorn entertainment right now, especially. Like I just wanna have fun. Like I was recommending, I've been shoving it on a lot of people, but the AP Bio, which is like one of the greatest sitcoms of the last like 10 years.
Yeah, the NBC show. Sure.
Yeah, they made a 3rd season just for the Peacock, and it is surreal.
Oh, cool.
It is like everything that they were doing in the first two, but with all the doors blown off because they only had 8 episodes or whatever to do whatever. I mean, there's one episode where like the main character like doses himself and accidentally and tries to record a TED talk, and it is mind blowing.
Oh, wow. Cool.
And like, yeah, it's one of I've watched that show through like 3 times probably during the pandemic, like all the way. And the 2nd season of Solar Opposites was like levels ahead of the 1st season.
Really.
The 1st season I liked, but I loved all the stuff with the tiny people in the wall. And the 2nd season, like every episode was better than the one before. And I was like, holy shit. And then they level up on all the people in the wall stuff too. And I was like, wow.
I'm gonna have to pick that up again. Yeah.
Because at first, like the first couple episodes of season 1, I was like, oh, this is not as funny as Rick and Morty. But yeah, I thought that really landed. Yeah, but
Good to hear.
yeah, I've kind of watched everything that was in my queue. I'm waiting for like more like either new British shows to drop or for Netflix or Amazon to actually like drop some of the stuff that they've been slowly producing. the fucking pandemic, man, it really screwed up production. Everything takes like a third longer to make now, and
Yes.
everything costs more. And I have some actor friends, and they'll text me when they're on set, because when they go do their scene where they're unmasked with, everyone's been tested, or now everyone's been vaccinated, so it's a little bit looser, I think. But because there's so many people on a film set or a TV set, they take the cast, like the second that they're done with their scene, that actor goes back and sits in like a glass cube until they're called. And they're just sitting there with like a book or texting. And my friend Anders sent me a picture of himself from like some Shonda Rhimes show. And I was like, man, is there a way we can keep these cubes for after the pandemic so we can control our actors better? No one will ever be lost again. There'll be no missing time on set.
Well, honestly, man, I've been talking to Joe Henderson, who just wrapped up making Lucifer and everything. And yeah, and also my buddy Julianne Emery is an actor. She was on the last season of Bosch.
Oh, wow, cool.
Guest star for this season and stuff.
Well, who was she?
She's and I can't remember her character's name, but she's the point of view, or the new character just for that season, who's another agent, federal agent or whatever she was.
Was she on the last season, or the one that's coming up?
No, the last season. It was
okay.
Season 6.
They're airing like a final season, like I think in a month or so, and then they have a spin-off of it. There's a Bosch spin-off that's going to like IMDb, which is now owned by Amazon too.
Yes, I've been watching shows on IMDb. So,
yeah, they have commercials, which I'm unhappy about.
That's interesting, Ed, because honestly, we're old enough to like be used to commercials. A lot of the like TV and all that stuff, so it doesn't bother me when I see commercials these days. But I can.
The only place I've been okay with commercials in the last 10 years is like TV Land, because they're all old commercials.
That's hilarious. She was Sylvia Reese.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know if she's got. Wow. Okay. Yeah, she's only had 2 credits since Bosch. I got to check in with Julie. But
it's a slow time for production still. It's speeding up. It'll, by the fall, I think, depending on how, as long as we don't have any more surges, like California, I think is down to its lowest numbers ever now. I think it's like 38 people for every 100,000 now that's been gotten sick from COVID or whatever. Everybody's getting vaccinated here now. It seemed like it took forever for the vaccine to get to the point where it was getting to the people who really wanted it. But now it's like, oh, maybe we can, actually go for a bike ride without a mask on. That would be nice.
Yeah, that's what Biden said. After we're vaccinated, we can. And dude, I cannot wait to get back to the gym, because I'm just a beach ball at this point.
Oh my God. Yeah. I like, I feel like it's like I've been a year and 3 months of like the holiday eating schedule.
Yes.
Where it's like you eat something and you're like, I'm still hungry, I'm going to eat more food. And it's like, that's not smart. And then it's just, I've started to realize in the last couple months how lethargic I've gotten, because I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to go outside and stand in sunlight.
No, you're right, man. Or you just bury yourself in work and you're not paying attention.
Yeah. I've spent so much. I've turned, like, in a lot of ways, the pandemic's easy for people who are like writers or whatever. It's like, it sucks to not be able to go out to restaurants or travel or see your friends or whatever. But like, I'm Zooming with people all the time for like Hollywood stuff, I work a lot with a lot of my friends, and and we have like, my wife has like this little movie club where every weekend we like watch the same movie together, and we all text each other and make fun of the movie. So we're watching like a lot of really old dumb movies, like Joysticks and what's the name of that? BMX Bandits. It was like an early Nicole Kidman Aussie movie where she's doubled by like a man who's 20 years older than her for all the BMX stunts. It's amazing. But yeah, like I still am having enough social interaction that it doesn't, that to me, it's just like, oh, this is just an excuse to stay home and write more. which I'm always looking for excuses to stay home and write more. So I feel like, it's been much harder on my wife because she's a much more social person and wants to have people come visit and all this stuff. Whereas I'm always like, oh, people are visiting, I better get a lot more work done before they arrive, like.
No, I get it. No, and honestly, that's why I'm glad I switched to video last year and doing as much as I've been doing in the last year. Because this is, as I told you before we started recording, as far as I'm concerned, we're social as much as we are helping you promote Friend of the Devil and everything. So
Yeah, definitely.
yeah. So, but again, I'm very intrigued in where the story's going to go next. Are you going to continue to time jump?
Yeah, the next book takes place in 1988, and then the two after that are like 89 and 90, like the end of 89 and 90. Like one of them takes place in LA, and then the other one's like a companion book, and it takes place in San Francisco around the same time, like right after the earthquake.
Okay.
Which is when I moved to San Francisco, was like right after the earthquake. And in 89, the 89 earthquake, the really big one.
Yeah, I remember. No.
The bad one where people died and highways collapsed and stuff. But yeah, I realized I may have moved to the 80s a little too fast, so I'm like jamming in 3 books at the end.
Well, that's what I was wondering, because I really do like this period that you're playing in right now. And again, with the severe jumps from the first book to the second book, fine.
Yeah, I've never seen a series. I guess the Easy Rollins books do it, but he never gets too far. Like it starts in the 40s and goes to like the mid 60s or early 60s over the course of like 12 books or 10 books.
Max Collins does it too with Nathan Heller.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't read those.
They went into the 60s. Yeah.
Yeah. I liked, like, one of the things I thought was really cool about this was like, a lot of times when you're doing first person narration, you at least have to know in your head, like, well, who is this narrator writing to? Like, even though you don't have to, you can just write it and not worry about it, and that's totally fine too. But for me, I always want to know, like, well, what's their point of view? Because often when you're doing first person, you're also slipping back and forth, especially in comics where you're kind of in the moment with the character a lot, because you're seeing the things they're seeing. So it's like, in a way, like the comic it doesn't have the same rules as like a novel would, but yeah, I decided early on that it would be him starting writing the books sometime around like 2015 or so, as he's looking back at his life and writing these books. So like he's talking about like modern life, and in 20 years this place will be like, like as he's driving north on 101 through all these like areas where I used to like live around there and drive through that area from the San Francisco airport to where we lived on a farm for years. And I would pass through all these communities. And I remembered in the 80s when all of them were like these kind of off the grid, cheap places to live. And now they're all like multi-million-dollar homes everywhere. And it's like Silicon Valley North, and, like that's part of the changing nature of it, is like I like being able to sort of look back at where we were and talk about where we are now, because you can see what progress has actually been made, and in some ways how the progress is negative in a way. Like I definitely think the line between rich and poor has gotten so much worse now. And the housing market is insane. Like when my parents bought a house, you used to be able to buy a house in California for somewhere between like $25,000 and $50,000, and if you owned your house for 10 or 20 years, you'd sell it and make like a 10% or 15% profit. But like by 2000 or so, you'd buy a house for like $400,000, and 2 years later sell it for $800,000, and it's like, how's that even humanly possible? like it gets to the point where you're just like, I can't even think about it. Like it's like the people growing up today are never going to be able to afford to own their own home. Like, is that what we're saying? Like, that's fucking insane. But that's how I felt like when I first got married and we were trying to like buy a house. I just kept thinking, like, oh, I've never, barely ever made any money. Like home prices are like 20 times more than they were when my parents were having to buy a home, you know, and it's just like, oh, this is going to be impossible for us in this huge stretch. And now I feel lucky that, you know, they weren't as bad as they could have been in 2000 or 2001, you know, like, thank God for the subprime mortgages. That was the only way I got credit at first. You know, of course we paid ours off, but
Congrats.
yeah, it's like I remember being like young and worried about that stuff, and I think about that for the future. It's like, how, you know, if you have a kid like coming out of college right now, like what kind of hope do you have for your ability to have the kind of life that your parents or grandparents have?
Totally, man. No, I know. I've got two nephews in their 20s, and yeah, it's scary. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad we grew up when we did. So
Yeah, so it's interesting with the Reckless books to kind of look back at that changing arc of history,
certainly.
because, you know, all this stuff is still relevant too. Like, you know, like the second book, you know, the stuff with the cult and how it sort of veers into the kind of mid 80s, like kind of cult persona with like neo-Nazis and stuff like that. Like, because that was a real thing that I, you know, saw up close in the mid 80s, like in Orange County and San Diego and LA, like that kind of neo-Nazi skinhead movement. And
Yeah,
you know, that's not a spoiler, he's on the cover. But yeah, I mean, I remember when all those cases were happening, and I was in like a coffee shop in San Diego once when some people got attacked on the sidewalk right outside. And I remember following that case, and that ended up being like one of the cases that was used against that big neo-Nazi guy who was like a big voice of that movement in the 80s, who ended up getting like shut down and sent to prison and stuff because he was inciting riots and violence and, you know, all this stuff. And I remember living through all that and thinking, wow, I'm so glad that's over. That'll never come back. God knows no one would ever want to be a Nazi again, but yeah, here we are again. But yeah, that's one of the things I think is so interesting about doing period pieces, is you get to see the difference in the way people acted, but that the problems are almost always still the same. Like history always echoes at us, whether we want to learn from it or not, you know.
understood, and absolutely, that's true. So you wrapped up the first arc of Fridays, or how's that experiment going?
I think good. I think Marcos is making enough on it to keep doing it. We're doing we haven't announced it yet officially, but we're putting out the first arc in trade paperback in the fall through Image, and then we're going to release all the arcs in paperback, and then when we're done with the whole full 9-chapter story, we'll collect that in like a big hardback.
Great.
But we really want to get it out to people in print, because I feel like it's just, you know, it's one of my favorite things that I've ever worked on. And everybody, like my audience, so much of my audience is print nerds, you know, like we do well in digital now, me and Sean, but I don't think we'll ever have the kind of, you know, most of our audience really wants a hardback book. Like this is the thing I've learned from, you know, Pulp and Junkies and now Reckless, is like I was able to, you know, our audience was split into 3 different groups basically, and I was able to find a way to get them all one product that they all wanted, kind of. And so, you know, I feel like it's digital comics are a strange thing. I'm not the audience for them. Like clearly, like I don't read a lot of digital comics. I don't read a lot of online comics. When I do, I will stumble across one and spend like an hour like going through all the strips that they've posted over the years, because I'm like, oh, this is amazing. I've never heard of it before. And some of them are hilarious. And it's like this huge subculture that I feel like is completely removed from the comics community that I come from, in a way.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
Talk to Dean Haspiel about his stuff.
Yeah.
I talked to Katie Cook about her stuff. Yeah, I know what you mean, man.
Yeah, it's like Dean is the only one from sort of my group that really went all in on digital stuff, I think. And you know, and Marcos, of course, who's created a full site. But even his site is like an experimental thing, because he wanted to see like, well, how would it be if you could name your own price? And you know, but yeah, I think it's an interesting experiment. For me, it's just like the joy of working with Marcos and Munza is so amazing, and he's like about halfway through the next chapter right now. He's moving a lot faster. Like after he finished the second chapter was like 40 pages long. So I think after he finished the first one, then I like right before he finished the first one, I gave him the script for the second one, and it was just so big, and you had to learn their whole backstory, and like I felt almost guilty when I gave it to him because I was like, you know, have fun. Like here's everything about the town and them, and you get to show how they met as kids, and you know. But yeah, I'm really loving doing that book, and you know, I would have never probably written that if Marcos hadn't written to me that day to ask if I had any ideas for him, and suddenly I did, you know. And but you know, I might have mentioned this last time I was on, but like doing Friday was part of what inspired doing Reckless, was because I was having so much fun on Friday. And I felt like the thing I was about to start writing for Sean, like we had just finished Cruel Summer, which as much as I love Cruel Summer,
Good story.
it's a bit of a downer in some ways. Like it's got its high points, but it's a depressing story about these kids growing up and their parents are thieves, and you know, and then it's about their parents who are thieves who are trying to find a way out of this life that they're all stuck in, and you know, all these storylines colliding in this kind of dystopian mid 80s that I lived through. And you know, like I just was having so much fun on Friday, even though I knew Friday was going to end up going to dark places as it has. I mean, it's Cthulhu-esque, Lovecraftian horror. It's going to have darkness in it, but I just like that. I think that reignited the idea of trying to do a recurring character, like a good guy character. And I just thought, why am I, you know, like I should be doing something with Sean that's just as much fun, and it'll be more fun for everybody to read and more fun for Sean to draw. And like Sean really loves drawing the same locations and stuff because he can sort of build the different angles that he's got for the location. And he doesn't build like 3D models for it or anything, but he's, you know, he knows the different sets, like what Ethan's apartment and what the balcony looks like and what the projection booth looks like and the candy stand downstairs. And, you know, like every book I add a new poster to the wall. Like, that's my thing. Like, but yeah, it's like Friday was so much fun to do that I just thought, why isn't everything I write just fun right now? Like I want it to just be a thing that is like a joy when I wake up in the morning to work on this. And, you know, of course I say that, and, you know, you get three or four chapters into something and it starts to become agonizing to work on because you're like, oh my God, I messed up, or, oh, I got to get this perfect. So I always agonize over it no matter what, but I do, like, I wake up every morning like jazzed to, do people say stuff like jazzed? I don't think people say
You're talking to
jazz
me, so it's all right. I'll accept
Yeah.
you. Sorry.
But I do, I wake up every morning and I'm like excited to see like, okay, where am I at in the book and what's coming next? And, you know, so sometimes to the point where I get ahead of my outline and I have to like take a break and sit down with my notebook for a while because I'm like, all right, I hope I didn't just go off the rails.
I understand. You know, you did a great interview with Kevin about all the Winter Soldier stuff, but there is one thing that happened recently that I do want to ask about, and that is they're changing his name. They're not going to call him the Winter Soldier anymore.
Yeah, I saw that. A bunch of people emailed me that today, or I wouldn't have known about it either. And I got a lot of like, sorry, this is happening. And I'm like, what's going on? Like, and then I looked into it. I was like, oh. And yeah, I was like, I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing that won't be permanent. Like who knows?
Right.
Maybe they'll call him Nomad. Maybe they'll call him that. And I don't think they're going to have a character called White Wolf right now. Like I wouldn't want I wouldn't want white in the first part of his name right now.
Yeah.
Just because it's, you know, whatever.
White.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Bucky is the Winter Soldier, and he will always be the same character that I brought back, and you know, made that. He's still going to have that same Winter Soldier backstory. I just think it's weird that they would spend like 12 years or something building this brand, which has, you know, sold like so many toys and you know, outfits and all this stuff, and people just really love that name. It's like every now and then you come up with a really great name, and you know. But I mean, they did this before. There was like this brief period where like Deadpool was called like Soldier X or something, remember? And
yeah. I'd forgotten about
the early 2000s or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's still Deadpool, and the movies are not called Soldier X.
Thankfully.
You know, so I'm gonna keep my fingers crossed that the Winter Soldier name will not fade away. I think, you know, I could see where I read like the quote from the showrunner, and I thought, well, I guess I could see where he's coming from on his logic of like, well, he's dealt with that and now he's going to move on or something like that from being the Winter Soldier. But I just thought, well, Black Widow is still Black Widow, even though she's a good guy now. Like,
Right.
that'd be like saying, well, James Bond got a promotion, so now he's 002. And I'm like, no, he's 007 forever. Like, you don't change the brand this far in, but yeah, you know, whatever. They'll do what they're gonna do, and you know, I'm always happy to see Sebastian getting more screen time, and you know,
He was great.
Yeah, I think he looks amazing in that part, and he's just really perfect for it. So, but yeah, I was like, there was a moment where I was like, what's going on here? Why would they do that? Like, because the Falcon is now Captain America, so they got to change Bucky's name too.
Yeah, really.
And also, the Winter Soldier historically is taken from an American, like one of the founding fathers. So, it's a Thomas Paine quote.
There you go. I didn't realize that. That's
yeah, no, it's from a Thomas Paine quote about the summer soldier versus the winter soldier. So it's, you know, I'm not worried about it. I think, you know, I'm sure that we'll all still be calling Bucky the Winter Soldier for the next decade.
I'm with you, man. That's hilarious. Speaking of soldiers and your background growing up on military bases, would you ever want to do a military story?
I've thought about it. I have a couple ideas for like crime stories that take place around the military. Like, I love like a Three Kings kind of a thing, you know.
Sure.
But I've thought about, like, you know, either as a movie or maybe a comic. I once had a dream of like trying to get the rights to Parker and do like a Parker origin story where it's like the end of World War II and he's like involved in a heist where they're trying to steal like German money or something.
Sure.
Like, I thought that'd be kind of funny. But yeah, I you know, I love historical stuff, so there's always that. I don't have that same Garth Ennis thing where like I think about the military all the time, because, you know, for me it was just the world I grew up around. Like, my dad and all of his friends were officers, and you know, my first movies I ever saw were at like outdoor movie theaters on the base in Gitmo. But yeah, I come from that culture so much that, and you know, my dad, when he died, had been in the midst of writing like a trilogy of novels that he was going to try and get published that all took place like around the Tet Offensive, because he was in Vietnam for a couple years, and he was like one of the heads of naval intelligence in like whatever area he was in. I think the Mekong Delta. And his brother was in the CIA at the same time.
Wow.
And like running like ops in the Mekong Delta as well. But my Uncle Ed, who I'm named after, was there, I think, for like 10 years, from like 62 to like 72 or something like that. Yeah, and that's where a lot of the stuff about Vietnam from Friend of the Devil comes from. Is my aunt's best friend was a Vietnamese woman who they brought back to America with them in 72, like years before the war was over. And so I got to spend a lot of time with this, you know, my aunt's best friend when I was a little kid. Like, when we would go visit, I would just like run around with my aunt and do all of her errands with her. And she was like a semi-professional golfer, so she would take me to the country club out near they lived in Virginia, obviously, because he was in the CIA. So they lived near the Dulles airport somewhere. But so I would go to like some country club, and I think everybody at the country club was like someone who was in the CIA probably. But I remember she would make me caddy for her, which was really hard.
What different cities? You mentioned Gitmo, and you were in Cuba, or was Gitmo's part of Cuba?
Yeah, Gitmo is Cuba. Yeah. We moved around a lot from, like, when I was born, we lived in Sterling Park, Maryland, and we moved to West Virginia for a little while to live with my grandparents, and then we moved to Cuba, and then we were going to go to Tokyo or Berlin.
Wow.
And then at the last minute, we got stationed in San Diego instead. And then we were there for a couple of years, and my parents split up, and so we just ended up staying there. But we would travel and take trips all around the world and stuff. And so as a kid, I was just used to just sort of going to different countries and meeting people from other places. And like we spent a year in Hawaii. Like my like ninth grade year, I spent in like living on Oahu and going to like a school where I was one of only like 5 or 6 white kids in the whole school, which was not that different to me than any, like everywhere I went. When you're a kid, like a military brat, you go everywhere and you're like meeting people from all over the world and from different cultures and stuff. It was just totally normal to me to be in school with a bunch of Asian kids or black kids, or like when we lived in Cuba, like a lot of the black Cubans had fled during the revolution and lived on the military base and worked for the military, like as doing like like our gardener was like a black Cuban who, like, they were, I mean, I was so young, I didn't know what was going on, obviously, and there was like people who were like refugees from Haiti and stuff, and so like they were all in school with us and stuff, and it was just that was just our life. We lived kind of in a multicultural world, because when you're in the military, that's just what you're around.
No, that's great. Would you want to pick up your dad's Vietnam stories to finish in any way, or have you thought about that?
I don't know. I would love to see them published at some point. He didn't finish. He finished one, I think, and it might need some kind of rewriting or something. But I would love to see, him have a book published. That was his dream. I don't think I'm a writer unless my dad, like wanted to be a writer. Like he, like his whole life, he joined the military. He had been a college professor, and he was going to get drafted, and his brother pulled some strings to get him into officers candidate school so he could go into naval intelligence instead. But before that, he was like an English professor at college, and was like a guy who just wrote constantly. And I remember like in the like early 80s, at some point, I guess maybe after when his mom died, he drove back east, and like I think he went through all of her stuff and found like a whole box of all of his writing from the time he was like in high school and up to whenever he gave up writing because he decided he was never going to do it or whatever. And I remember him bringing this box back, and my brother and I both digging through it and finding all these amazing like short stories and things from his own life, and it was just so inspiring. And he was like, he wanted to be like Hemingway or John Updike or one of those guys. That was like his goal, I think. So it was interesting to grow up with a dad like that, because he was definitely much more to the right than I am. But pop culture wise, he was like reading Ross McDonald and Raymond Chandler and Nabokov, and he was like a guy who would voraciously read anything. Like he would read like high literature or Pulp Fiction or whatever, and he wanted to go to the movies all the time. And he took us to Ken Russell movies when I was a little kid. Like one of my first like horrific memories of being in a movie theater was going to the Ken Cinema in San Diego at like age 8 and seeing The Devils, which is still like one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. It's like, and we were seeing one of the edited versions, obviously, because you can't see the unedited version with the orgy scenes and stuff. But he would take us Saturdays, we would pick the movie, and Sundays he would pick the movie, and he would just tell us not to tell our mom about Sundays. We would like spend the whole drive home just talking to us about the movie and reminding us it was just a movie. And but it's funny because like I talked to him about this later in life, and he didn't have any memory of a lot of these movies. And I was like, what are you talking about, Dad? You were the biggest Ken Russell fan. Like, why would I have seen like Women in Love and like, well, yeah, like I remember being really excited when Ken Russell directed Tommy, because he thought, well, you guys are into The Who. I was like, Dad, I'm 9. That movie's a horror movie in my mind.
It is so depressing and sad. And yet it has these incredible musical performances in it as well. God, when Clapton's doing Eyesight to the Blind, it is so cool. And just the Who at their most powerful in the early 70s.
Yeah, everything about that movie scared me, from like the, because it's like the little kid finds his dad dead and his mom's cheating on him, and the dad shows up and gets hit with a lamp or something.
Yeah.
He has to cover up the crime, and like all of that is so terrifying to a little kid to see. I remember for years, there's like a scene where he's being babysat by Keith Moon.
Right, yeah, Uncle Ernie,
like
middle about
weird old uncle with the trench coat and the hat. And I remember there's like a scene where he's got him in the bathtub and he's like pouring like orange juice all over him. And I used to have nightmares that Keith Moon would be my babysitter and just drown me in Sunny Delight.
I understand that. No, as much as I love that movie, sing it, I'm like, I don't ever need to see this movie again.
Yeah.
Ken Russ is fascinating that way. And again, when you guys were talking about it on Another Planet and talking about Lair of the White Worm or Gothic, God,
yeah.
Oh my God, these are disturbing films. Absolutely, man.
Yeah. But also one of those guys who, even with the lowest budget that he could get, would make it like a really interesting movie. Like I'm glad that I was like scarred by his movies as a kid, because it made me like kind of have a little bit of a fascination for those weird auteur art filmmakers that used to be commercial. His movies made money. There was a reason he got to continue making stuff all the way up until like the late 80s, early 90s. But yeah, he would make some really disturbing stuff. That's really crazy. Like Peter Greenaway, like my dad, like when we were older, I remember when Peter Greenaway movies first started coming out, and I'm like, oh, my dad's gonna love these. I remember when I saw Cook the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, I called my dad afterwards. I'm like, you gotta go see this, Dad. It's super disturbing. You'll love it.
Hilarious.
They eat a guy at the end. Like,
see, my dad.
Spoilers for 40 years ago.
My dad, the two big ones that really, and I love the fact that he exposed me to these movies, were The Third Man. And it was amazing, where it was on like at 1 a.m., on a regular over the air.
Yeah, the late night.
And he's like, you want to know what I did in the Army? Because he was an MP chasing black marketeers in the occupation, and he was in Vienna. And exactly what it looked like. And I was like blown away. And it really tied me to my father. And that one, and also he loved Anatomy of a Murder. He's this was like taboo. He goes, this was banned in cities. Because it was so raw back then. And he goes, it's the same now. And I'm like, okay. And it was on like at 2 a.m. He's like, will you stay up with me? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, absolutely, man. And it was fantastic. So yeah, those are like the two great.
Yeah, I remember like the last years I was living with my dad, every now and then I'd wake up in the middle of the night and go down to get a glass of water, and I'd find him up like in watching like an old movie in the middle of the night, like a noir film from his childhood or something. And I'd sit down and, that's where I saw like Fritz Lang's noir films, like The Woman in the Window, and he made like 2 in a row with Edward G. Robinson, which were like both really very similar, but I always get them confused. But I remember in one of them, like Edward G. Robinson is like a painter who gets like, used by like a woman. But I remember the first time I saw that, like not understanding what noir was, like I was like 12 years old or something, and that was like, I was just like, oh man, this is amazing. Like I just thought, oh, this is like Hitchcock, which is like, I realize now how lucky I was to have that education. Like my dad took us to see, like the first time I saw Rear Window or something was probably when I was like, I don't know, 12 or something, when they did those re-releases.
Cool.
And we went to like a triple feature and saw like Rear Window and Marnie and Vertigo. And it was like, that was when he like let those come out after they'd been sitting in a vault for like 25 years or something. And those are still like some of my favorite movies. And, like that, I think that was really the first time I saw something that I would even consider sort of noir-ish, was like Vertigo. And I remember even as a kid being annoyed at the scene at the end of Vertigo where she writes a letter and explains the whole plot of the movie. Because even as a kid, I had figured it out. I was like, I didn't need that. I'm like, that's a studio note. Like now I know there was a producer somewhere going, I don't get it. Can we have a scene where she explains the entire plot of the movie right towards the end? But it's such a weird, obsessive movie. And now, like, the more we know about Hitchcock, the more we know how autobiographical, like, Jimmy Stewart's character in Vertigo was. It's like he finds a girl who looks sort of like the girl he fell in love with and just basically forces her to become that girl. And then, big twist, she actually is. But I remember that scene where he's like, it can't matter to you what color your hair is. It's like, try saying that to your wife.
And it's Jimmy.
It can't matter to you what you look like. It only matters to me, the man. That was really funny.
Put the dress on, for God's sake.
Yeah.
And it's Jimmy Stewart of all people. And it is literally like the most disturbing role I think he ever had. Absolutely.
Yeah. And as has been pointed out, Jimmy Stewart of all actors probably has the highest death count of World War II because he flew bomber missions for years. So there's a whole other side of Jimmy Stewart that no one knows, or no one talks about. It's just amazing.
No, you're right about that, man. I just read that book. I think it was by Scott Iman, the guy who did that amazing John Wayne book. And it was all about Jimmy Stewart and Fonda's friendship and really kind of twin biographies throughout their life.
Oh, yeah.
Really cool.
Oh,
really
good. I want to read that.
It's excellent. Any news on? I mean, don't worry, Ed. We're wrapping up. I promise.
Oh no problem.
No, honestly, I almost have a goal because you and I usually go for like 2 hours or whatever.
Yeah.
I always feel terrible about that, but I know.
No. I always just worry that we've never talked about the comics enough. It's so easy to go off on a tangent about pop culture, but I feel like people like that when we do that.
100%. Jesus said absolutely. And as I've told
you,
this
is like, how did this get made, but with no topic?
Right, man, and truly, God, Gabe Hardman and I are doing an Outer Limits podcast. In fact,
wow.
And we're looking at the original first 2 seasons of the original show.
Are you going episode by episode?
Oh yeah.
Oh wow! And you do a whole podcast episode just about an episode of wow, that's amazing.
And Ian Brill's part of the group, and Andy Parks and Jeff Parker. And it's kind of like a video book club when we look at each episode and everything. So
that's
man,
amazing.
And there's tangents galore.
I wanted to do that with the Rockford Files, like the Rockford Files, and just like there's so many episodes. It's like it's 5 or 6 seasons, and they used to make like 28 episodes in a season back then too. Yep. So you could do that for the rest of your life. Just analyze the Rockford Files.
You're right about it. No, and absolutely. And that's why it was fun. Gabe actually is like, how come there's not a good one for Outer Limits? And I'm like, let's do one. And he goes, and we're having a blast. No, it's great.
I remember it must have been 7 or 8 years ago, someone started one where they just went through all the Peanut specials.
Oh wow, fun.
It was a little disturbing because they decided that the humans might be alien, the adults must be aliens because they didn't speak the same language as everybody else. I was like, whoa. I was like, no, they are not. They are 100% not. Miss Othmar is a human. Linus is not in love with his teacher who's an alien. I refuse to believe this.
When you're writing your Jughead comics in your dotage, you're gonna have to write some Peanut stories. Obviously. I still love it.
No, no one could ever match Charles Schultz. He's the greatest comic writer ever.
Oh yeah.
I forgot my goal of retiring to write Jughead comics. Now I think my goal is just to never retire and just keep doing books with Sean forever until one of us dies.
Honestly, man, it's been a great journey watching you guys work together since Sleeper. Well, Sleeper's where I started the journey with you guys.
That's basically where we did Gotham Noir before that, but
right. Okay.
But a lot of people don't know about that one. DC recently reprinted it in something I can't remember, and they did a collection that has the Man Who Laughs thing, the Joker one shot that I did with a couple other things in it. And I got them to include Gotham Noir in there because I thought that would be a cool one to keep in print because it's the beginning of me and Sean as a team. But I had written that whole script before I had any idea who was going to draw it. So Sleeper was the first time that I worked with him when I knew he was going to be the artist. And I remember I turned in Gotham Noir and not knowing who was going to draw it. And then Mike Carlin and I talked about different artists, and then Sean's name came up, and he was drawing Wildcats at the time. So he would do like an arc of Wildcats and then do like a batch of pencils. And I remember getting the entire book all in pencils. And at that point, Sean's pencils were just like pen, like it was just the outlines of shapes. It wasn't real pencils like he does now, because he's drawing pencils digitally. And I remember the first time seeing him just being like, oh my God, how is he going to turn this into art? And Mike was like, oh, don't worry about it. He does all of his drawing in the brush and pen on the page. And I was like, no way. And, you know, then I ended up working with him for the rest of my life. But yeah, it's funny. I got, because we recently reprinted, oh, here, I'll show you for your viewing audience. We recently reprinted the Criminal Deluxe editions because we put out the third one. So we printed volumes 1 and 2 again, which had been out of print for like 10 years. So we did these new editions, and it's been a little bit of a rocky road getting them on sale. If anyone who reads my newsletter will tell you, it's been quite dramatic, quite the most boring drama of all time. It turns out if you've got a book that's been out of print for more than 5 years, when you reprint it, it is very hard to get Amazon to deal with it the way you want them to. It's working itself out now. The buy buttons are turned on and stuff, but basically it was like, oh, until it's actually on the shelves in the Amazon warehouse and they have stock, their buy buttons default to like second party like people instead or something like that. But,
so you're not getting any. Yeah, I mean, it's
so well now we are. It was a little bit of like a rocky road getting it there. But yeah, we reprinted those, which, you know, but I was just shocked to see the demand for them, like, because we sold a lot of those before through the Marvel editions and stuff. And but yeah, it really felt like suddenly there was like this whole new audience who's come onto our work in the last 5 or 6 years who wanted these things actually, and that was just a blast to, you know, to see. But I was dealing with the Amazon side of it for a while, and I was just like, never let anything go out of print ever again. But so I was complaining about it in my newsletter, or explaining about it in my newsletter, I should say. And a bunch of people wrote in to ask about Sleeper, because I guess now Sleeper's out of print again. And I was like, I have no control over that. I wish that I could get the rights to Sleeper, so like Sean and I could put out like a definitive Sleeper that was designed by us or whatever. But, you know, DC owns that and they control it. They've put out several different collected edition versions of it. They put out the original trades, and then they did like a big hardcover of all 25 issues or whatever we did, or 30 issues. I can't remember how many it ended up being altogether. But the hardback that they put out is a doorstop. It's enormous. And then a couple of years ago, they started collecting it like half in one book and half in another. And I think they didn't put out the second half or something like that. So I get a lot of email from people who think that I have something to do with that. I also get a lot of email from people complaining to me about like Marvel books that are out of print and stuff. And I'm like, should I forward these to David Gabriel? Like, what's like, I don't know. I'm like, I don't think anybody, like, you guys should be writing to Marvel. Like, if I could control when the Winter Soldier books went out of print, it would be a whole different world. But it's I always feel bad because it's like, I can't write back to everybody who writes in. I try to answer the questions in the newsletter when I get a bunch of questions about the same thing. But I saw, because I had been talking about the frustration of getting this situation sorted with the reprints, which, you know, comic stores have had no problem getting them because they're used to buying books from Diamond. But yeah, then I suddenly got a bunch of emails from people wanting, you know, what about this book, or what about this book? I was like, wow, like our like readership has really turned into the, you know, the hardback collectors, which is an interesting thing. I really feel like the market, you know, maybe it's just us and we're just lucky, but I do feel like on some level the market is shifting a bit. And you know, we're seeing, I still think you're seeing like a lot of books that come out that are selling like insane numbers. Like Image has had, I think 2020 was one of Image's biggest years, including with the 3 months of shutdown.
Yes.
You know, I think it was one of Diamond's biggest years in the last 10 years, actually.
Yep.
Even with the shutdown and losing their second biggest supplier, you know, so that's just been kind of crazy to see. But yeah, it's like you'll see these books that launch and they're selling like a couple 100,000, and like I think that Donny Cates book Crossover is still like one of Image's best-selling books right now. And it's interesting because I think the market is shifting more towards long-term like graphic novels and trades, and it's been shifting that way for 20 something years.
Sure.
But I think when you hear about these numbers and then you look and you're like, oh, but it has like 18 covers, or like I think there's this weird bifurcation where there's still like a big collector's market. Like I hear a lot of comic stores actually had a pretty good 2020.
Yes.
And then you talk to some and it really seems to be divided between the stores that are sort of full service bookstore, like graphic novel stores, that they had a good 2020 because they shifted into being able to do mail order, and they knew how to reach their audience because they had like these mailing lists, because if you're a comic store, you have your customer base that is like your regulars. And if you're a smart comic store, you have all of their emails, and you can update them on what's coming out this week or whatever. So to be able to turn that into, okay, well, you can do pickup at the store, and how like they all really adapted really fast in a way that like I was really concerned when the market shut down. I was like, oh, that's it. Like shit. Well, I guess it's been a good ride. Like I hope something comes out the other side, and then to see the industry really thrive during the pandemic. But it really seems like, so some of the stores became like those kind of like mail order hub kind of places where people get their weekly comics and their graphic novels, and they suddenly realize how great it is to have a comic store in their life. So they're spending more money there because they want to make sure the store survives the pandemic. But then a lot of stores I hear did really well on back issue sales and stuff. And then you hear a lot of stores like taking comics that are suddenly worth money and like putting them on eBay and making a ton of money on them. So like it's comic stores have always been that kind of hodgepodge of their toys, their cards, their gaming, their comics, their everything. So it's like they're sort of built to survive too, because it's a small business empire, and everybody who runs their own small business is willing to go a certain amount of time before throwing in the towel. Like everybody's there to survive. It's like, well, they're all long-term thinkers. Like, this is what I'm doing. No one opens a comic store and is like, I'm going to do this for a couple years and then sell it. It's like, no, you open a comic store because you love comics and you want to have the coolest comic store in your town, because whatever store you used to shop at started getting on your nerves, and you're like, I could do it better than them. Or they closed and there was no comic store, and you're like, this town could support a comic store. I want to be that comic store. And so it's, I always say I'm so glad that comic stores were such a weird niche market, that in the 90s there was no Borders or Barnes and Noble that could be the comic book superstore, or a Blockbuster, which shut down so many local video stores.
Right.
Comics was always considered such a small thing that nobody cared about, that no big chain ever came along and kind of blew up the whole market. Because if it had, those chains would have gone out of business and there'd be no comic stores now, and it's like, thank God there's, like 3,000 stores out here in America, and who knows how many in, Europe and England and Ireland and the ununited kingdoms.
No, you're right. Australia, Brazil. I mean, all the markets. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love like one of the things that is the most like exciting thing about what Sean and I are doing is that we are such a known quantity to the stores that carry our books, that like if it were anybody else, I think going from single issues to graphic novels, they would order low and just count on getting reorders, because it's a lot of money to drop to get a $25 hardback. You got to buy. But I'm getting these photos from stores where they bought 100, like the thing I put in my newsletter today.
Yes.
That's a human-sized stack of
That's
books.
Outstanding, Ed. That's
I was
amazing.
like, that is, and that's not even like the most ordered by stores. And I was like, that's insane. But then I thought about it, and I was like Reckless has, we'll see. I'm worried. Initially we printed so many more of Reckless than we did of Pulp, because I wanted to make sure we had copies of Reckless in print when Friend of the Devil
Sure.
and Destroy All Monsters came out. I didn't want to have to go back to press in between.
Right.
But now I'm guessing we are going to have to, because,
Wow.
you know, like by the time, yeah, we'll see what happens, but I'm guessing before Destroy All Monsters comes out, we're going to need to end up going back to print on it, because, you know, you want to keep them all in stock. But yeah, like we've sold more copies of the Reckless hardback than we sold of the first issues of the last 2 comics we put out. And the first issue is always the most that you ever sell. And I was like, this is insane. Like, and Pulp now, like we're almost sold out of the paperback edition of Pulp, and we're going to have to go back to print on that. So Pulp, this weird one-off thing that I thought no one would care about at all,
It was great, man.
has become like one of the best-selling graphic novels of the last year. Like Pulp and Reckless were the number 2 and number 3 sold graphic novels through Diamond last year.
That's fantastic.
And the first was Kirkman's Firepower, which I will point out was only $9.99.
Ed,
My books were expensive.
no, Ed, honestly, like for instance, the retail price on Friend of the Devil, it's $24.99. Totally, like it's a satisfying read. As someone who's, you know, gone from periodicals to graphic novels, and and also just seeing the prices that the big 2 sometimes puts on books, it's like that's a hell of a deal, and it was a very satisfying read. And especially if you want to jump on a brand new book and stuff, it's
also like, I thought about it too, because it's like Marvel and DC now charge $5 on average for a comic, like roughly, and sometimes as much as $8. And I thought, you know, like I think some of them are still $4, but I remember when comics went up from $3 to $4 when I was writing at Marvel, and I was really unhappy when that happened, because like we lost more than 25% of our sales on every book I was working on, because a lot of people were like, well, I'll wait for the trade then,
right,
or wait for the trade and not buy the trade. But I remember just thinking, $1? We're raising the price $1? Like that's so much money. And I remember pointedly putting my books at $3.50, like the Icon stuff I would do $3.50, and then eventually I was convinced that if someone was going to pay $3.50, they'd pay $3.99, which turned out to be true. But yeah, I like when we were figuring out how to do Reckless, like, and whether to do paperback or hardback, and it was really like I talked to a bunch of different retailers who do really well with our stuff, and they all had just sold out of hundreds of copies of Pulp in one day, or 1 week, and they were just like, look, your audience is showing up the first week. If I don't have those books in stock, they're going to order them online. Like it wasn't like a slow burn where people ordered low in advance, and people ordered Reckless like they were ordering the first issue of a new comic book, and it's a $25 price. But I added up and I was like, it's still cheaper than buying 6 comics from DC or Marvel. You know, like, and it's the equivalent of like 6 comic books worth of content, you know, but all in one fell swoop.
Yep.
And, you know, and it's on amazing paper, like the cover, like I saw a quote from someone when I was like browsing through, I was like ego searching Twitter to see if people were talking about the book in like January or whatever, after it had been out for like a month. I'm like, all right, what did people say about it on the internet? I gotta know. And one of the comments I loved was someone saying like, this is actually the nicest book I've ever owned in my entire life.
Nice.
Like just pure quality. And I thought, oh, that's amazing, like to hear, because I care so much about that part of it, like the package. I want it to be a thing you're proud to have on your shelf. No question. And I saw someone else the other day, I saw someone refer to the books as dad comics. Like comics for your dad. And I'm like, that's perfect. It is actually.
In the words of Paul McCartney and Wings, what's wrong with that? I'd like to know. Absolutely, man. I mean,
yeah. Well, it is. It's like that thing you can, because any comic book person who's, you know, above a certain age, their dad probably did not grow up reading comics, or never quite understood why they never quit reading comics. And it's like, I always want to have that book that you can give to your, like my wife's grandmother is like 102.
Oh, that's great.
And she reads mystery novels nonstop.
Oh, that's
When I first started dating my wife, I gave her aunt was living with her grandmother at the time because she just had some surgery, and they would both just sit around the house and watch soap operas and read mysteries at the same time. And I remember I gave them all of Greg Rucka's mysteries, and one of them I hadn't actually read yet. And I was reading it, and I gave them copies, and then I was reading it, and I got to this part halfway through the book, and it was like a really gruesome kind of queasy scene that was like the kind of scene that when you read it, it sticks with you for a few days, and every time you think about it later, you're like, oh, that was gross. I wish he hadn't described that so perfectly. And I remember like going to visit my wife's aunt. We went out to visit them, and her grandmother was like such a huge Greg Rucka fan. And I was really worried I was about to get flack for like giving them some stuff that was a little too hardcore. but I love that about like, you know, that I remember when I first started doing, you know, comics at Vertigo and stuff, when I did Scene of the Crime, a lot of people were like, oh, I bought a copy for my dad for Christmas so he could see that there are comics that are like the books he reads.
Right.
And so I always have had that in the back of my head, is like, that's got to be one of the things that we do. It's hard to convince that market that you're doing that. It's hard to convince people who
the crime novel market.
Yeah, it's like it's easy to you know, if someone's a comic book person and they see that, it's like, but I am hearing from a lot of people who are like bought an extra copy for, you know, and one of my old editors at one of the big two told me that he bought a bunch of copies of Bad Weekend to give to a bunch of the assistant editors for Christmas last year, which I was like, that I loved hearing.
That's fantastic. Like, absolutely.
But I remember that I wrote it back. I was like, well, you know, half of those stories came from you telling me stuff about the old days.
That's outstanding. That's
but
great.
Yeah, I love that. It's like these hardback books are just, you know, they're like great objects on their own, you know.
Oh yeah. But also, you know, again, I'm glad, because obviously the generations before us that read the daily comic strips and stuff, you know, Rip Kirby and
oh yeah,
Agent X, that was made for an adult audience. And it's great that the pendulum swinging back, and now that we're in our, you know, middle age years and stuff, we love sophisticated comics. And,
yeah, exactly.
You know,
I'm so glad to live in an era where, as an adult, I can actually tell people what I do now and not be embarrassed by it. Like, I was reading the new Stan Lee book that came out, the Reisman one. And I had no idea that he spent most of the 50s trying to escape from comics into newspaper strips, because especially after the Kefauver hearings, when, you know, if you went to a cocktail party and you told people you worked in comic books, they'd be like, oh, you guys should be run out of town on a rail. It's like, what? Like, holy shit, like nothing Stan Lee ever did was offensive enough to be run out of town on a rail. Like, he was the most middle of the road guy. But yeah, I was just like, I mean, there's no injury to the eye motif in an Atlas comic. And if it was, Ditko did it. But yeah, I remember like I was reading that part and I was just like, wow, that's so sad that, you know, but then I always thought Stan Lee was such an odd character because he'd literally been in comics for like 21 or 22 years before he was considered successful.
Yeah.
Like, he was a big thing in comics as an editor, and he ran a company and whatever.
Sure.
But he went from being a guy who was just kind of like a journeyman hack who, you know, ran a company and assigned, you know, like, you know, inventory stories here or there. He wrote stuff when he had to write it. It wasn't like his passion, to being the biggest thing that ever happened in the history of comics overnight almost. You know, him and Jack Kirby, because of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, of course. But, you know, I mean, I will always point out that the Jack Kirby comics that are written by Stan Lee are better than the Jack Kirby comics that are not. So I don't know how much his contribution was or wasn't. And I would, you know, I wasn't there. I won't argue with people about it. You'll hear, even in that book, it seems like there's 5 different stories for every one of them. So that was what was interesting to me, is I thought there would be a definitive answer. And I'm like, there's no definitive way to know. I mean, he got way more credit and money than everybody else did. So he's considered the bad guy. I think that the last years of his life sort of are the karma for, you know, all of that to a large degree, you know, though I'm sure the Kirby family would think maybe not enough karma.
I understand,
you know, like,
yeah.
But I always thought that was so weird. If you looked at comics, it's like, you've got the early days of comics when it's just like a bunch of stuff that's happening, and then Superman hits. And then that's the biggest thing in the world, and it changes everything. And Batman comes out because of Superman, and everything is a reaction to Superman. Wonder Woman, you know, Captain Marvel, Shazam, as we now call him, or whatever, Shazoom, I don't know, Sharzam. Like all of that stuff was a reaction to one thing. And there's a lot of great material that a lot of those people did. I mean, I think those old Captain Marvels by Beck are actually like amazing for their era. Eisner, obviously, in the 40s was like one of the best people doing comics of all time. You know, working with Jules Pfeiffer and Harvey Kurtzman. And, you know, there's a lot of great comics in the 40s and 50s that really stand out. But then suddenly you have, you can really go from like Superman to like the ECs to like the early Marvels. And that's like the Marvel stuff was like a revelation. And then everybody spent like 20 something years trying to sort of be the next Stan Lee or write like Stan Lee. Like after Stan stopped working at Marvel and Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas and all these guys were writing, and they were all kids, you know, like Marvel, they all came in as teenagers and not much older. And they were all kind of writing like Stan. Everybody was kind of, you know, he was such a huge influence on the entire industry. And you don't have anything like that again until Alan Moore. You know, Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, that era, the British invasion, you know, Neil Gaiman would be the last sort of person in that era, I think. And then you don't really have any other big changes in mainstream comics after that point until probably when my generation arrives, which are all people from independent comics. I mean, you had the odd thing here or there. I still think Marvel's was like a huge revelation, but a lot of people didn't try to ape that. You know, that was like a really unique one-off thing where it was like Busiek and Alex Ross sort of doing this amazing sort of street level view of what it would be like to live through all of that, which no one had ever really done at that point. And I remember at the time just think, I mean, I think Marvel's was a big influence on Gotham Central for me. It was like, well, what if it was like something like that, but with cops? Like, what is this world? What does Gotham City feel like from the point of view of a cop who needs to turn on the bat signal because they can't even do their own fucking job because they're dealing with the Joker? And it's like, all right, I guess we better call in this illegal vigilante. But really, like Marvel's is kind of this one-off thing in the early 90s or whatever. And you've got the Image revolution and all that stuff. But I don't think, like initially, Image was a artist-driven company. I don't think anyone looks back at the early days of Image and is like, you know, other than Kirkman, I guess, who was growing up reading that stuff, most of the people I knew in comics at the time were just amazed how well they were selling. And we're like, well, I guess mainstream comics are a totally different thing than what I grew up with. But it's like, it always amazes me that Stan Lee was like 21, 22 years into a career, and then suddenly the biggest thing in the entire world. It's amazing he didn't become even more of a, you know, like egomaniac or, you know, whatever than he did, like, because, you know, he spent 10 years trying to get out of a thing, and suddenly it was like, oh, this thing that you were trying to get away from is the biggest thing in the entire fucking world. And, you know, it must have been insane for him to watch it become what it became over the last 20 years. Like him in all those movies. I remember he's in like the next scene after mine in The Winter Soldier, and I was like, oh, come on, don't put me right before Stan. like give us a breather. Let people go, was that Ed Brubaker?
Did you ever meet him, Stan?
Several times, and he never remembered me.
He never remembered?
No. I mean, I think he was by the time I met him, I don't think people were talking about it, but I think his vision was pretty bad too. Like he was usually being led around by some people. He had a couple bodyguards. I remember the first time I was supposed to meet him, I'd done a signing and he was doing a signing at the Marvel booth right after me. And it was like the year that like I had probably had like 15 issues of Captain America out or whatever. So the Winter Soldier was like a big deal. And I remember I bought a t-shirt for the convention that said rule number 1, Bucky stays dead. Because there was some people selling them online. And I just thought, I'm going to wear that because like, awesome. I'm going to be the asshole who makes fun of myself at the convention. And so I was wearing that to my signing at the Marvel booth. And Stan was signing after me. I kept thinking I had this enormous line. And I, you know, at that point, I was not a big name in comics at all. You know, like my ego's big enough to know that, you know, whatever. But I kept seeing this, it was wrapping around. I'm like, is that for me? And then someone was like, no, that's for Stan, dummy. He's standing right after you. And I was like, oh, okay. That makes sense now. And I remember it was the year that we were about to publish Criminal, because I had printed up a couple thousand copies of the preview thing for Criminal as like a little 8-page giveaway.
Sure.
And I had this huge box of them sitting under the table. And so Stan had this enormous line. So I just walked down the line, just like handing those out to people. And so I gave away like 500 of those to people waiting to get an autograph from Stan Lee. And then I think they wrapped his signing up like 15 minutes early, because it was like thousands of people wanting his autograph and a moment with Stan. And he was backstage in the booth. And I think Tom Brevoort or someone was like, oh, you need to meet Stan. I'm going to bring you back after his signing and you can meet him. And so like he was in the back area, and I went to try to get into the back area, and he had these 2 big bodyguards at the time, one of whom I think is involved in like one of the scandals towards the end of his life. I recognized him in a photo, but he had these guys, I think they were like twin brothers or similar looking, like maybe Irish twins, but they were like Samoans or something. And one of them was just standing in front of the backstage door. And I said, yeah, can you move? I'm supposed to go in the back. And he's like, yeah, no one's going back there. Stan's back there. And I was like, but I work for Marvel. I'm supposed to go back there. He's like, yeah, don't know what to tell you, man. You're not going back. Stan needs to relax for a little while and needs some peace and quiet. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I was just standing there because I didn't know what to do, because I had like a panel in like 20 minutes. And I'm like, well, I don't know what to do. I was standing there. And then the guy looks down at my shirt and he's like, rule number 1, Bucky stays. You don't like Brubaker's Captain America? And I picked up my badge. I'm like, I'm Brubaker. He's like, oh, and I'm like, so can you let me go meet Stan Lee now? And he's like, no, can't do it. And then I think Joe or Dan Buckley or someone saw me, and they were like, I'd come back, and and then I met Stan, and every time I met him, he said the same thing. Oh, you're the guy who brought Bucky back. And then we would talk about Gene Colan for a minute, and I would say, well, Gene told me that you said that you'd bring Bucky back whenever sales got low enough. And I said, so it finally must have happened when I got the book. And he's like, did I say that? I probably did say that. And but every single time I met him, we had that exact same conversation. And I remember saving him from some paparazzi one time at outside of a party. He was in the like velvet rope line, and they just wouldn't let him go. And I like leapt over the rope, and I went over to him like, hey, Stan, Ed Brubaker. And I like led him away to his people. And I remember he gave me this kind of double take. He's like, Ed Brubaker. Oh yeah, you're the guy who brought Bucky back. And I was like, yes, Stan, I've met you 5 times. But whatever. He was like, I didn't know at the time, because he always wore those dark shades. Like he was like 90% blind.
That's what
I was like, he never read any of my comics. He couldn't read any of them. Like,
No,
it was amazing that he knew that I did that.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I remember talking to you when either like when Cap was dead during Civil War, and you told me that Joe Simon played along, and I don't know if you got a chance to talk to Joe, because I know he was still alive when all that was going on.
Yeah, no, I know Marvel arranged that for him to like act irate or whatever.
Yeah.
How could they kill off Captain America? And I guarantee you I'm not doing that about the Winter Soldier changing his name. But no, I remember, it was funny when I was doing Prez, my first Vertigo comic, which, at that point I thought Vertigo comics were aimed at young adults. So I'm it's fun. It's a funny book to look back on, because I think I was trying to do something they weren't trying to do.
Interesting. I love Prez, absolutely.
But I remember at the time, Lou Stathis was the editor, and Prez was a Joe Simon creation from like his time at DC in the 60s, when he did like Brother Power the Geek and all his weird sports comics that he was doing. Yep. And I remember Lou Stathis had the same dentist as Joe Simon, and ran into him there and told him he was working on a revamp of Prez.
That's cool.
So that's like the closest I ever got to any of those, because I met Jack Kirby when I was a little kid a bunch of times, because I would go to the Comic-Con, and he was always just really nice, and you could sit there and watch him draw, and he would just talk to you. And a lot of the guys, it's funny because I think you can never remember how you were as a child. You remember your experiences, but it's like you have to delve really hard to try to remember like how annoying was I as a kid? Because I can remember one comic convention where I think I spent probably 2 or 3 days just standing and watching Paul Smith do drawings and talk to people, and to the point where after a couple of days he just started talking to me,
Oh wow.
like asking me questions, and like wanting, because I was just the biggest. He had just taken over X-Men, and he was like my favorite X-Men artist ever, and I
Sure.
think still he's my favorite X-Men artist ever. Um, but yeah, I did that. I remember one time when I discovered Warlord when I was a kid, the Mike Grell comic. I went to Comic-Con. I'd saved up my allowance for like several months. I was like 12 or 11 years old, and I went and I bought every issue of Warlord that I didn't have. So I had like basically a short box, and I walked up and Mike Grell was sitting next to Bill Sienkiewicz, and I said, and I don't know how I even said it, but I basically asked him to sign an entire short box of comics, which I have signed many short boxes full of comics at Comic-Cons for people, often dealers. Or I've actually once signed a long box and I didn't realize I was signing a long box full of comics, but the guy just kept putting more. And it was like all Captain America #25. It was all the Death of Cap issue. And it was like, I remember when I finally finished the box, the people in line behind that guy started clapping because they were so angry. And I stayed like an extra hour at the signing to sign them all. But because I've walked up to like one of my heroes and with an entire like collection, here's 45 issues of Warlord, please sign these. And I remember Mike Grell was like, all right, well, I got to do some sketches, so you're gonna have to come sit here next to me, and I'll sign a few in between every sketch. And I sat there for like 4 hours.
Wow.
With Mike Grell, and he starts taking out his layouts, which he used to sell these. He had like a cheapie pile, and it was like $10, and you'd get like 8 pages of layouts from
Yes.
Warlord or like Legion of Superheroes or something like that. And he started showing me all of these, and he gave me like a pile of them from Warlord, and he was showing me how he laid out the pages, and it was all like drawn in like Bic pen or whatever. It was like ballpoint pen and stuff, no penciling. And it was just amazing, like that these guys would take their time to, I was this shy little weird kid, and I would just kind of, wherever I, whatever kind of bluntness that I have would just come out in the, oh, I want to talk to this guy about his art. And so like if some kid walked up to me and wanted to like have me sign a whole short box, I'm not going to be like, yeah, come sit next to me. First off, it's a different world than it was in the 70s. I don't think that would be allowed now.
No.
To have like a 12-year-old kid that you don't know sitting next to you behind your panel. That would be questionable. Mike Grell was a perfect gentleman. There was nothing weird about it. But I remember like, and I was like, oh, that's Bill Sienkiewicz. And Sienkiewicz was drawing like Moon Knight at the time. And he's like, oh yeah. And he was like giving me gossip about, oh yeah, he's like the new Neil Adams. And I was the previous new Neil Adams. And, so it was like, you could really have those moments at Comic-Con back then. Like it was a great like learning experience. But I always think about that when I'm at conventions, and I know, you can never have every interaction that you have with fans or readers at a convention is not going to go well. Like there's always those moments where you're like rushing from a signing to a panel to dinner or whatever, and you only have a minute to sign someone's book, and you can't give them the experience that they really came there for, which isn't your autograph. It's to have a couple of minutes to talk to you.
Absolutely.
And like when you don't get that, or like I've occasionally had people like bring me comics for my X-Men run, and I'm not the giantest fan of my X-Men run personally. Like X-Men was a thing I was given as a favor. Like Mark Millar was going to do both of the X-Men books, but he wasn't ready. They weren't going to be ready to do it for like a year. It never happened. It was like him and Hitch and someone else were going to do it, and Hitch was going to draw one book and someone else was going to draw another one. And so I was just going to do X-Men for like a year until that happened. And then it didn't come together. And then they just said, well, would you like to stay on the book? And I was like, well, I guess, sure. But like, I look back at it and I'm kind of like, I wasn't a great fit for that book. Like, it's just personal. Like I meet people every convention I go to. I meet someone who really loved like an issue or two, or even my whole run of X-Men, and I'm always like amazed. And I guess a couple times I've been kind of like, oh wow, because I thought I did a terrible job on that. And I've had people think that I come across as a jerk for saying that. And I'm like, no, I'm just self-deprecating. Like, but you just never know when you're at conventions, like how those moments are gonna. I remember one guy wrote a blog post about what a jerk I was at a convention once. And I reached out to him to find out, like, what are you talking about? And he told me, and I realized he had come up to me at a signing at the exact same time my wife was calling me when we lived in the country, and our neighbor had come over while I was out of town to threaten to burn down our house. And so I was like having a panic attack. And meanwhile, this guy who was a retailer, actually, the blog post he wrote was about how he was never going to carry Anime Comics ever again because I was rude to him at a signing. And I was just like, holy, first off, I can't remember being rude to anybody. But then when he reminded me of the circumstances, I totally remembered. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, well, this is what was happening. And then he ended up becoming like a huge supporter of my work,
Oh, that's great.
which was the happy ending to it. But I remember at the time in the early message board days, just being like, I did? How could I have, like, because I always try so hard to, I mean, you know me, I'm like I don't, it's not a lot of effort, but I try not to be rude to people or like flippant. But I realized like sometimes you can just be sarcastic and you just, you know, it's like, I mean, you like Comic-Con is a whole different beast than it was when I was a kid. Now the doors open and thousands of people run through the place to try to get to that weird like one-off toy thing they've been waiting a whole year to try to buy so they can sell it on eBay for 50 times what it's worth. You know, it's like a whole different, like I watched the documentary about Comic-Con you know, years ago, by the guy who did
That's
Super Size Me.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, the one. Yeah, him and Whedon did that
Yes.
documentary about Comic-Con, and I remember not recognizing the Comic-Con from it at all. Like I don't. This isn't my Comic-Con experience at all. Like it wasn't my experience as a kid. It wasn't my experience in the '90s, like when I was just breaking in, and it's definitely not the same Comic-Con experience I have as an adult. You know, like it's just really fascinating. Like a con is a different thing for every single person that's there. Like there was no cosplay when I was a kid.
Right.
It was a very rare thing. You'd see the odd person in a costume, but usually if you saw someone in like a really good costume, they were like a model who was being paid to be there to hang around. We called them booth babes, which is like terrible. I mean, it's in Bad Weekend. It's like, but that's a lot of times what they were, was like a paid model who didn't read comics, didn't know who they were dressed up as even. And I remember like, you know, it was like, and now it's like half the Comic-Con is people in amazing, sometimes better costumes than the stuff that's on the TV shows. I've seen some Wolverines where I'm like, that guy looks exactly like Wolverine. Like how did he even do that? Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually has like blades inside his arm. You know, like,
mentioning the X-Men, is that the reason why you had Matt co-write the X-Men with you?
No, I don't know if that was why. It's hard to remember that far back. Matt was more interested in it. Partly it was we were working on Iron Fist together, I think.
Right.
And Matt was being teed up, I think, to become like a big writer there. And I think he was more interested in the X-Men than I was. And so the idea was we would co-write a little bit of it and then he would just take over. It was, you know, more of like a way to sort of help him get in the door a little bit. But I think he was more jazzed for that book than I was, maybe. Like for me, it always felt like I was doing everybody at Marvel, like, you know, it was like, oh great, okay, I'll do the X-Men for a year. I can handle that. Like I'm not a huge team book writer. Like I say that, and you know, my Cap run might as well be a team book.
Well, and even
Secret
Avengers, I thought, as brief as it was, I really enjoyed Secret Avengers.
Yeah, that one I struggled with more. Anytime that it's an official team book, I like it breaks my brain because I feel like you're supposed to give them each a certain amount of weight. And when it's like a book like Daredevil or Cap, I can bring in all these side characters, but there's no obligation to give them each a certain amount of space per issue. Whereas with the X-Men, I'm like, well, did Beast say anything this issue? Does anybody care? You know, like somebody's going to care. Sure. You know, like and with Secret Avengers was a little bit of a struggle always. And it just, I think too, it was like late in my superhero writing career, and I'd written like 500 or 800 superhero comics by that point.
Yeah.
And I was getting to the point where like, I also at Marvel at that point, after Disney had bought them, like the schedule got upped a lot. So a lot of books that were popular that were putting out 12 issues a year were suddenly putting out 18 issues a year.
Yep.
So they were shipping every 3 weeks or something, or every 2 weeks, and then a month where they'd only have one. And that was just impossible to keep up with. You'd be writing issue 3 of one storyline, and then you'd jump ahead to write issue 1 of the one that came after it for a different artist. And I remember at some point it just got like, I was always starting the next thing before I'd finished the one before, and it really just kind of took the wind out of my sails. And it made me start to realize, because sometimes then I would just be writing the ends of both stories at the same time. And the end of every superhero story is, you know, some variation on the theme of let's put on costumes and fight, and whoever wins is correct. And that's why I always did well on stuff like Cap and Daredevil or Catwoman and Gotham Central, because the good guys could lose. You know, in Cap, I could kill off Cap and have it be about like, what is the world like without Captain America? And then what is the world like with Bucky being Captain America instead? And, you know, having it be part of the Winter Soldier redemption arc. And, you know, with Daredevil, like, you know, Bendis and I made that deal to do the handoff with him leaving him in jail and me picking it up with him in jail. And you know, like I had his wife, like, you know, go insane. Like, you can just torture Daredevil. You can do so many great things with Daredevil that it's just like, you might as well just be writing like mystery pulp fiction or something. Like those places where I was able to find a way to bring my own voice into those books are always the ones that I look back on the most fondly, like Gotham Central and Catwoman and Daredevil, like, and Cap. Like, I love what we did on Iron Fist. That was just insanity. Like, that was me and Matt, like, turned up to like 15, and Matt just losing his mind on all the crazy Pulp Fiction stuff that he wanted to jam into that. And, you know, that's one of those things where I'm just like super proud of it. But I remember writing to Matt and David when they did the last issue after I worked on it up to 15, and then they did 16 without me. And I was so jealous because 16 was like the perfect issue and I didn't actually work on it. But I was also so proud of them for having done the best issue of Iron Fist ever. And, you know, and then that led to them, you know, going on to doing Hawkman, or Hawkeye, I mean, which, you know, is one of the greatest things that ever has been come out of Marvel. So I feel like, you know, like my generation, me and Matt and Bendis and Hickman, and, you know, I feel like a lot of us really made marks on what was going on at the time at those companies. And, you know, but yeah, I just, you know, I don't mean to demean anybody who loved my X-Men run. It's just like, as a writer, you look back at different things and you wish you'd done this differently or that differently, or, you know, I remember talking to Frank Miller the first time I ever met him, and, you know, Frank and I became really good friends for a while, and he kind of took me under his wings, and, you know, he gave me a lot of insight about Catwoman when I was first starting on it, and that's how I knew Holly was a lesbian, which didn't come across in the Batman Year One.
Wow.
And he was like, "Oh, she was a lesbian. Her and Selina's bi," and I was like, "What? Whoa!"
Yeah, cool.
You know, and but I remember, like, when I was talking to him about Daredevil, and he said he wished that he'd quit after the issue after Elektra died, where like it ends with like Matt digging up her grave and finding her there. He wished that he'd had the guts to leave Daredevil at that point.
Wow.
But he didn't know it was the most popular book. It was like X-Men, Daredevil. Like, those were Marvel's 2 big sellers. And he was the biggest name in comics you know, since Stan Lee at that point. And he said, you know, that he didn't know what to do. It was like, how do you, you know, no one tells you to walk away from success. And so, but he said he looks back at that and he kind of considers his Daredevil run, you know, like the official end for him is like that one issue. Like, he wished he'd never brought Elektra back. He wished he'd never done all the ninja stuff. And I was so shocked because I love all that stuff. Like, I was like, how dare you not wish that you had done, you know, but, you know, I think he also wished he hadn't brought Electra back because he didn't want other people to use her, you know. So.
Sure. But
Yeah.
no, I know, and that is amazing hearing that about Frank. But yeah, no, I can appreciate that. And no, it's I as always, man, I appreciate like when you do look back at some of your old stuff and you know
Oh
how
yeah, it's always fun to talk about
no,
that stuff.
it's true. You're right. I mean, everyone, the outside perception. That's the great thing about art. You don't know how it's going to hit people, even as you're making it and stuff, and what their reaction will be to the stuff you make.
Yeah, yeah. Oh wait, here, let me show you one more.
Sure, this is great, Ed.
Go.
Ed, I can't thank you enough for doing video.
It's so good I have props though.
No, but it's awesome. They look great. Fantastic.
I was like, they're both out. This one's been out. This one came out today.
This one came out today. Yeah. And are you making
painted covers by Sean?
Is there a Reckless playlist? Because I can't help but notice that both. I don't even know if there's a punk song called "Destroy All Monsters." I certainly know the movie.
But, oh yeah, no, I haven't come up with a playlist yet. I was, you know, I jokingly told people when you're reading the first one, you should listen to the first Rodney on the Rock album, because it's just all early '80s punk and hardcore. But yeah, I haven't thought about what the Friend of the Devil one would be. It would probably have a lot of bands that we still hear today that we had no idea we were going to be stuck with. Probably too much Depeche Mode. If there's someone out there saying there's never too much Depeche Mode, they are wrong. But it would probably be that. When I think about the mid '80s, for me, it would have been like stuff like The Cure and all that synth pop shit.
Oh, God.
I'd throw in a bunch of New Order stuff, even though at the time I was really, I was so angry that they just weren't as cool as Joy Division.
Ed, you're speaking of my high school and college years. I know exactly what you're talking about, man.
Yeah. My favorite New Order song is still the very first one that they ever recorded, Ceremony, which was really the last Joy Division song. I'm kind of obsessed with that song to this day because musically it sounds like the first single version before they did the remix with the keyboard. Musically it sounds exactly like a Joy Division song.
Certainly.
But then it's sung by, you know, whatever the guy from New Order, I can't remember his name, the guy who sang most of the New Order songs, the guitar player. But it's just really fascinating because it's like that moment between when Joy Division was such a huge thing and like still to this day loved by so many people from so many different walks of music. You know, still you put on like, I remember when we were making the show, like John Hawkes showing up in like a New Order shirt or something, and then us just talking about how Joy Division was the best band of all time and the best bass player ever and all this stuff. Like it's still like a band that just still feels like they could have come out last year always. Whereas like New Order at the time when they first were coming out, I was like, it's like the ding 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 ding. It's like, it sounds so candy ass comparatively, you know, and now I love it. It's like the best music of that era. I've seen New Order live like 10 years ago. Like now they play Joy Division songs actually, which is kind of
that's cool.
They didn't used to, and now they have a new bass player, and so they play New Order, or they play Joy Division. But they play like all their hit songs, and you realize they have like 40 like hit songs. And then all the Joy Division stuff. So you're like, oh, this is like a 3-hour set of like 60-year-old men playing some of the best music ever. But I remember like, there was no way anyone thought New Order would ever be bigger than Joy Division. And then they were like the biggest band of the entire 1980s, probably.
One of them, absolutely.
One of them, yeah.
Shelley Bond and I have really gotten to know each other in the last couple of years. And, you know, she's all about her 80s music.
Yeah.
I love that. And Chris Cantwell, you know, he made *Halt and Catch Fire*.
Yeah.
And that soundtrack is so fucking amazing. I mean, it's a great show anyway. But my God, with the songs he pulls out of that, I adore it. It's great.
Yeah, that show's really good, and that's one of those shows that's deceptive too, because like it gets better after the first season. Like the first season has to establish so much about like the time, computer technology of that era, which, you know, nowadays it's so hard to remember like what it was like back then. Like I remember getting a TRS-80, which was referred to as a trash 80. because they almost never worked. That was the first computer I had, and it had a tape cassette drive. So it took like 25 minutes to run a tape cassette through it to be able to play like Pong.
Yep.
You know,
Yes.
or Space Invaders or any
Yes.
of those. And it was like, and 90% of the time it didn't load properly and you had to rewind it and start over it. Like computer tech was so weird in the 80s. But yeah, that show, when it jumped ahead in season 2 and decided to just focus on the women characters and them starting this gaming company and all of that, like that show really just like blew me away at that point, to the point where like by the time it was over, it was one of my favorite shows on TV. You know,
No, I hear you.
the final scene where like they're trying to figure out what the future holds for them, and then one of them's like, "I had an idea," and you're like, "Oh, is it PayPal? Is it going to be PayPal?"
Ed, good hangout, man. You did it.
Yeah.
Honestly, I now I know. And unfortunately, once again, we've gone over 2 hours, but that's all right. I love it. And seriously, you're always generous with your time.
Well, it's dinner time here now, so
I'll let you go. And yeah, I mean, you know, you're always welcome back. I hope we do talk when Friend of a Devil is due. And
oh yeah.
All right, thank you.
Destroy All Monsters, yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Friend of the Devil just came out today. Reckless is already out. Get them both if you haven't already. And yes, Destroy All Monsters, the next chapter. But in the life of Jacob and Sean and Ed. So we look forward to.
All right, man. Well, thanks so much for having me.